history is full of forgotten peoples. But every now and then, the dead return with a mystery so strange it forces us to rethink the ancient world. In the deserts of China, archaeologists found mummies whose bodies survived for millennia and whose DNA pointed to a population unlike any known on Earth. Before we step into that story, take a second to like the video and subscribe for more ancient mysteries. The dead appear where almost nothing should last. Beyond the better-known river valleys of ancient civilization, beyond the green belts that usually anchor early human history, there is a basin so dry, so wind-scoured, and so unforgiving that it seems built not for memory, but for erasure. The Tarim Basin lies in the far west of China, ringed by colossal barriers of stone and ice, with the Taklamakan Desert spread out at its heart like a warning. In summer, the heat shimmers over salt flats and hard-packed earth. In winter, the cold can feel surgical. Water is rare, distance is enormous, and the horizon has a way of making human beings look temporary. And yet this is where some of the most astonishing ancient bodies on Earth are found, not as bones or stains in the soil, but as people who seem to have been waiting in the dark for someone to notice them again. They do not look like the usual ruins of deep antiquity. They look interrupted. Hair still clings to their heads. Eyelashes remain. Woolen garments hold their weave. Leather, felt, twine, and fur survive in a state so intact that the mind briefly refuses the dates attached to them. Some are laid out with a care so deliberate that even after millennia, the arrangement still carries a sense of intention. They are not fossils and not statues. They are human beings arrested by dryness and salt, by a landscape that kills quickly but preserves with eerie generosity. The effect is immediate and unsettling. The usual protective veil of time falls away. History is no longer an abstraction built from broken pottery and collapsed walls. It has skin. It has cheekbones. It has hands folded over a chest. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, what makes the Tarim mummies so powerful is not only their condition, though that alone would be enough to make them famous. It is the strange collision between place, body, and expectation. These people are found in one of the harshest inland regions in Asia, and yet many of them appear almost tenderly preserved. They come from a world of burial grounds scattered around the basin's edges, in oases and dry channels, in places where ancient communities clung to survivable margins. They are dated largely to the Bronze Age and after, though the human story of the region runs much deeper, and from the moment their faces became widely known, they seem to pose a dangerous kind of question, one that invites confident answers before the evidence is ready. Who were they? Where did they come from? Why do some of them look so unlike what many expected to find in ancient Western China? And what, exactly, does a face preserved by desert chemistry really tell us? For decades, that last question is often handled badly. The visual shock of the mummies does much of the work. A modern eye sees light hair on some individuals, long noses on others, woven textiles that feel closer to one ancient world than another, and immediately begins building a story. Stories like that are seductive because they arrive whole. They do not have to wait for laboratory results, or careful chronology, or the slow, frustrating work of separating ancestry from language, culture from appearance, and appearance from imagination. The Tarim Basin becomes a stage for projection. The dead are made to speak too quickly, yet the deeper the evidence grows, the stranger the reality becomes. The mystery does not shrink under scrutiny, it sharpens. The basin itself helps explain why the discovery feels almost impossible. To the north rise the Tian Shan Mountains, to the south stands the Kunlun Range, to the west are further knotworks of high terrain that tie into some of the mightiest mountain systems on Earth. In the middle stretches the desert, an interior world where rivers descending from snowfields fade into gravel fans, marshes, and dry lake beds. Human settlement here has always depended on edges, on fragile ribbons of water, on precise knowledge of seasons, routes, and resources. It is not the kind of environment where large mistakes are survivable, but it is exactly the kind of environment that can preserve a body when burial conditions align. Dryness strips away moisture. Salt-rich soils can inhibit decay. Cold seasons slow breakdown further. What should be gone remains. What should have dissolved into anonymity holds its form. That preservation changes the emotional temperature of archaeology. Most ancient populations are known through fragments, and fragments are easy to keep at a scholarly distance. A cracked bowl does not meet your gaze. A femur does not seem to suggest personality. But here are individuals buried with hats, cloaks, boots, baskets, food offerings, carved objects, and carefully made textiles. Here are children and adults. Here are faces that seem, in photographs, too recent. Even experts can feel the pull of that immediacy. It is one thing to discuss population movement across Eurasia in technical language. It is another to stand before a body with braided hair and feel the unnerving compression of time. The evidence remains incomplete, but the presence is overwhelming. The larger world around these burials is no less dramatic. Long before the famous Silk Road ties east and west together through trade and imperial ambition, this region already sits near the meeting zone of very different ecologies and human networks. To move into or around the Tarim Basin is to navigate threshold steppe and mountain, oasis and salt desert, pastoral mobility and fixed cultivation, local adaptation and far-reaching exchange. Nothing about life here is simple. And nothing about human identity in such a place can be reduced to a single origin story. Yet for outsiders, the basin often appears as a blank between better-known civilizations. That blankness is misleading. It is not empty. It is difficult, and difficult places often preserve histories that more fertile regions overwrite. The mummies first become internationally famous not just because they are old, but because they seem to contradict neat maps of the ancient world. People had grown used to imagining early civilizations as belonging to a handful of familiar centres, each with its own tidy sphere. But the Tarim dared emerge from the desert with clothing technologies, burial customs, and bodily features that resist that tidy arrangement. They suggest movement, contact, adaptation, and perhaps long isolation all at once. They hint at populations that cannot be understood by one line on a map running east or west. This is where the mystery takes on its true shape. The bodies are not simply preserved remains. They are evidence that the human past is less obedient than the stories built around it. And there is another reason the discovery matters so much. Ancient bodies with this level of preservation do more than enrich archaeology. They reopen the oldest problem in history itself: how much disappears even when people survive, and how much survives even when a people disappear. Languages vanish, ritual meanings collapse, kinship systems dissolve without a trace. Names are lost almost immediately, but cloth remains, food residue remains, burial architecture remains. A lock of hair remains. Later, with the rise of genetic analysis, something even more intimate can remain ancestry, not as identity, but as a buried record written in the cells of the dead. That possibility turns the Tarim Basin from a regional puzzle into a test case for how modern science can illuminate the deep human past without flattening it into easy conclusions. At first, though, there is only the encounter. Excavators and researchers working in these burial grounds find themselves staring at people who seem to have crossed an impossible bridge. The desert has kept them. The desert has also distorted them. Because preservation is not the same as transparency. A mummy can mislead as easily as it can reveal. Features may appear sharper, skin may tighten, colour may shift, burial context may be incomplete. Later disturbance may alter what is seen. Scholars still debate aspects of chronology, cultural affiliation, and how best to interpret the full range of evidence across different cemetery sites. But no single explanation fully accounts for the shock these discoveries create, both in science and in the public imagination. The Tarim mummies arrive carrying two burdens at once: the burden of proof and the burden of everyone else's desire to solve them too fast. So the story begins not with an answer, but with a landscape and its impossible gift. In a desert that looks hostile to memory, memory has taken physical form. It lies in wool and leather, in plaited hair, in dry hands and carefully arranged graves along the margins of vanished waters. It lies in a basin enclosed by mountains, where human life once depended on narrow chances and durable skill. And it lies in the unsettling fact that some of these ancient dead will eventually reveal a genetic heritage unlike that of any known population now living, and unlike what many researchers once expected to find. That revelation is still ahead. For now there is only the desert, the bodies, and the first feeling that something in the old map of Eurasia is about to give way. The wind continues to move over the Tarim Basin as if nothing has happened. Sand shifts. Salts whiten the ground. The mountains remain where they have always been, holding this interior world in their immense ring. Yet beneath that silence rests a human archive so improbable that it forces the past back into focus, not as legend, not as patriotic myth, not as a neat migration tale polished for convenience, but as a harder and more fascinating truth. Whole communities can live on the edge of survival, shape a culture in one of the most severe landscapes on Earth, disappear almost completely from memory, and then return thousands of years later with their faces intact and their deeper origins more mysterious than anyone imagined. Once the first shock passes, the faces begin to do what human faces always do. They invite stories. A skull can be measured, a textile can be catalogued, a grave can be mapped, but a face, even a desiccated one, exerts a more unruly power. It encourages recognition, and recognition is dangerous in archaeology because it so easily becomes assumption. The Tarim mummies are famous not only because they survive, but because they seem familiar in the wrong place. Some have long, narrow noses, deep-set eyes, or hair that appears brown, reddish, or lighter still under desert-preserved conditions. Their clothes are often beautifully made. Their hats, cloaks, boots, belts, and woven fabrics look like the work of people who understand not only survival, but style, texture, and symbolic display. Seen through modern eyes, especially in photographs detached from full archaeological context, they almost seem to have stepped out of some imagined Western Bronze Age world and wandered too far east. That impression would shape the debate around them for years. The visual impact is strongest because the preservation is not merely anatomical. These are not bare bodies stripped to the minimum needed for identification. They remain wrapped in material culture. Woolen textiles hold patterns and stitching. Felt caps retain their form. Leather shoes and boots show practical craftsmanship shaped by a difficult climate. Some bodies lie in garments layered for warmth and movement, suggesting a lived understanding of cold desert nights, abrasive winds, and seasonal extremes. Hair survives in braids or loose strands. Fur and woven cords remain beside them. In some cases, the body and its possessions seem so complete that the burial resembles a paused departure rather than a final disposal. What survives in the record suggests a society deeply attentive to clothing and burial display, and perhaps to the social meaning carried by both. This is one of the reasons the Tarim mummies seize the public imagination more readily than many other ancient remains. They appear personal. There is a difference between knowing that ancient people wore wool and seeing wool still wrapped around a shoulder. There is a difference between reading that Bronze Age populations buried their dead with care and seeing the exact tilt of a body placed into a coffin, the way hair has been arranged, the way felt rests near a cheek. The distance between observer and subject narrows uncomfortably. These people cease to be a generalized past. They become individuals again, or seem to. And that seeming can lead both scholars and audiences toward a false confidence. The dead begin to look as though they can be read at a glance. One of the most famous examples is the figure often called the Beauty of Lulong, a young woman buried nearly 4,000 years ago whose preservation is so striking that modern viewers often describe her in terms usually reserved for portraiture rather than archaeology. Her face appears refined, her hair still visible, her clothing carefully made. She's not alone in this. Other burials from the wider Tarim region reveal men and women with similarly arresting features, some tall, some wrapped in patterned textiles, some wearing distinctive headgear, some buried with objects whose forms hint at ritual or status. A few individuals acquire a near-mythic place in popular discussion simply because photography translates them so well. They can be placed on magazine pages, in documentaries, in museum displays, and their expressions, however altered by time and preservation, seem to ask for narrative. Who was she? Who were they? How did such people come to lie in desert graves in Western China? The problem is that preserved appearance is not a passport. It does not reveal language, ethnicity, political identity, or belief in any direct way. Hair color can change after burial. Facial features are shaped by complex inheritance and are easily overinterpreted through modern racial categories that do not map cleanly onto ancient populations. Textile styles can travel farther than people do. Objects can be traded, imitated, repurposed, or adopted by neighboring cultures. Even burial customs can be shared across groups with different ancestry or identity. Yet because the Tarim mummies look so vivid, the temptation to make broad claims from physical appearance proves hard to resist. For a long time, many accounts move too quickly from visible traits to sweeping conclusions about origin. That early confidence is not entirely irrational. Some of the textiles associated with the mummies do bear comparison to weaving traditions found farther west across Bronze Age Eurasia. Twill weaves and other sophisticated fabric techniques appear in contexts that seem to link the Tarim Basin, at least materially, to larger exchange zones. Certain hats and garments evoke wider steppe or Western traditions. The bodies themselves, especially in early descriptions, are repeatedly characterized as displaying features more often associated in modern imagination with Western Eurasian populations. In the absence of ancient DNA, and before the full archaeological picture matures, it is understandable that researchers begin constructing migration theories around what they can see. The face becomes evidence. Clothing becomes evidence. The desert-preserved body becomes a kind of visual argument. Yet even at this stage there are warning signs. The cemeteries are not identical to obvious Western parallels. The environmental context is highly local. Burial forms, grave goods, and ritual arrangements do not simply reproduce a known culture transplanted whole from somewhere else. There is distinctiveness everywhere one looks. The Tarim dead are familiar enough to invite comparison, but strange enough to resist being filed neatly into someone else's archive. Scholars still debate exactly how to interpret this blend of resemblance and difference. Was it migration followed by strong local adaptation? Was it cultural borrowing layered over older population history? Was it a mixture of peoples from several directions? Or was the Basin preserving a social world that had drawn influences from afar while still remaining stubbornly itself? Even before genetics enters the story, no single explanation fully accounts for the evidence. The clothing alone hints at that complexity. These are not casual wrappings thrown around a corpse. They are the products of spinning, weaving, stitching, tanning, shaping, and long familiarity with available materials. Some burials show use of wool that points to herding economies connected to sheep or other livestock. Some include felt, a material associated with skillful manipulation of fibre under pressure and moisture, ideal for mobile or harsh climate societies. Leather footwear suggests practical adaptation to ground conditions that are abrasive, freezing, and unstable by turns. Caps and cloaks imply social as well as environmental meaning. A hat is never only insulation. A belt is never only utility. In ancient societies, dress can express age, sex, status, affiliation, and ritual role all at once. What survives in the record suggests that the people buried here cared how a body entered death, and that care reflects a world of symbols largely lost to us. This is where the faces in the sand become more haunting than merely exotic. The usual shallow reading says they look foreign. The deeper reading says they look like members of a vanished community whose own categories are missing. Modern observers can identify their textiles, compare their cranial measurements, debate their apparent affinities, and later sequence their genomes. But the emotional grammar of their appearance remains harder to recover. A braid can signify beauty, rank, mourning, adulthood, or something else entirely. A red or brown textile can be chosen for warmth, prestige, or ritual purpose. A tall felt hat can mark an office now unnamed. The evidence remains incomplete, and the better preserved a burial is, the more acute that incompleteness can feel. It is painful to see so much and still know so little. The public response, unsurprisingly, often ignores these cautions. The mummies become magnets for racial fantasy, nationalist claims, romantic speculation, and crude historical storytelling. Some see them as proof that the region once belonged straightforwardly to one later people or another. Some treat them as lost wanderers from Europe before Europe exists in any useful sense. Some fold them into grand narratives of civilizational diffusion, as though every craft and every custom in Asia must have been imported from somewhere familiar to Western historiography. Others react in the opposite direction, minimizing visible evidence because of how politically charged the implications might seem. The dead, once again, are forced to carry the anxieties of the living. But stripped of those modern burdens, the faces themselves tell a quieter story. They tell of bodies preserved by one of the driest climates on Earth. They tell of communities skilled in wool, leather, and survival. They tell of burial traditions that honoured the dead with care and structure. They tell of a desert margin where life was precarious enough to require ingenuity but stable enough, at least for a time, to produce continuity in craft and custom. They also tell of the limits of sight. Looking is where the mystery begins, not where it ends. For all their extraordinary visibility, these mummies cannot be solved by appearance alone. Their faces are the doorway into the puzzle, and perhaps also its first trap. That is why the Tarim Basin exerts such a peculiar hold on the historical imagination. It offers unusually intimate access to ancient people, while simultaneously undermining the certainty that intimacy usually seems to promise. The preservation feels like revelation, but it is only partial revelation. The eyes are closed, the voices are gone, the names are lost, the garments remain, but the full meaning of those garments does not. A modern observer confronts a strange reversal. Here are ancient people who seem easier to picture than to understand. The desert has given us their outlines with astonishing generosity, yet the social world inside those outlines must still be rebuilt from fragments, inference, and caution. So the faces remain in the sand, at once vivid and unreadable, familiar and profoundly distant. They draw early scholars toward one set of explanations, and later scientists toward more careful ones. They make the mystery visible before the data can explain it. And they remind us that the human past is often most deceptive when it looks most clear. These people are not illustrations for a theory that already exists. They are the reason that theory must be rethought. Their preserved hair, woven clothes and striking features do not close the case. They open it wider, forcing the story out of the realm of first impressions and into the harsher, more interesting terrain of landscape, survival, and evidence. To understand why the dead survive here so well, it helps to imagine the basin before thinking about the graves, not as an empty patch on a modern map labelled Xinjiang, but as a vast enclosed world with its own rules, sealed off by mountain walls so immense that they shape every movement of wind, water, animal, and human being inside them. The Tarim Basin is not a simple desert plain. It is a complicated interior, bordered by the Tian Shan to the north, the Kunlun to the south, and linked westward to knotworks of ranges and passes that have always been difficult, seasonal, and dangerous. At its centre stretches the Taklamakan, one of the most formidable deserts on Earth, a landscape of dunes, gravel, salt-crusted flats, and vanished channels where a wrong turn can become a death sentence. Around its edges, however, where rivers descend from snow and glacier, thin ribbons of life appear. These margins are where human settlement becomes possible, and where the story of the mummies truly begins. The geography of the basin creates a kind of trap, though not only in the obvious sense. It traps water in fragile systems that rarely reach an open sea. It traps communities along oasis chains and river fans, forcing life into narrow, habitable corridors. It also traps the dead. In regions with abundant moisture, bodies return quickly to the soil. In the Tarim Basin, the opposite can happen. Dry air leaches moisture from flesh. Salty soils suppress the chemical and microbial processes that usually erase a body. Cold winters interrupt decay even further. Burial pits cut into arid ground become chambers of desiccation. The result can be preservation so remarkable that hair, skin, textiles, and wooden structures all endure side by side. The landscape does not preserve out of kindness. It preserves because it withholds the conditions decay requires. This environmental harshness is easy to romanticize from a distance, but for the people who lived here it was an ordinary and absolute fact. Survival in the Tarim Basin depends on precision. Water sources shift, river courses migrate or fail, oases can contract or disappear, sand advances, Salinity damages soil. Wind reshapes paths and surfaces. Pasture quality changes with season and climate. A settlement placed slightly wrong in relation to water or wind may not last. A herd moved too late may suffer. A harvest mistimed can become catastrophe. What survives in the record suggests communities that are neither accidental nor naive. Anyone who makes a life on the margins of this basin learns quickly that the environment offers very little forgiveness. That is one reason the basin should never be imagined as isolated in the simple sense of being untouched. It is cut off, yes, but in selective ways. Mountain barriers block easy mass movement, while passes and corridors still permit contact with those with knowledge, stamina, and motive. The desert center discourages direct crossing, yet the edges create chains of inhabitable nodes. The Tarim world is therefore both separated and connected. It keeps populations apart. But it also channels movement along particular routes. It can preserve local distinctiveness while still allowing objects, ideas, crops, animals, and techniques to travel astonishing distances. This double condition will become crucial later, because one of the deepest puzzles of the Tarim mummies is how a population can appear so genetically unusual, while clearly participating in broader networks of cultural exchange. For now, though, the basin's main role in the story is to explain the strange intimacy of the evidence. Cemeteries survive here because wood survives here. Coffins survive. Textiles survive. Botanical remains survive. Sometimes even traces of food and fibres cling to the archaeological record with an eloquence rare in wetter worlds. It is possible in such a place to recover not just the fact of burial, but the manner of burial. One can see how a coffin was shaped, how a garment was woven, how a body was arranged, what objects were placed nearby, and sometimes what plants were available or symbolically important. The desert is harsh to the living, but generous to the future historian. It keeps details that more forgiving climates would destroy. And yet that same generosity comes with distortion. A preserved landscape can fool the eye into believing that what survives is complete. It is not. Even in the Tarim Basin, most of life leaves no direct trace. Sound is gone. Language is gone unless written. And in these early periods, writing is absent or uncertain in the contexts that matter most. Gesture is gone. Social meaning is largely gone. Kinship structures, political tensions, seasonal rhythms, private grief, jokes, songs, obligations, and fears all disappear as thoroughly here as anywhere else. Preservation gives texture, not totality. The evidence remains incomplete, and the better preserved it is, the easier it becomes to forget how much has vanished around it. Still, geography does allow us to infer the kind of discipline a community must possess to endure. A settlement on the desert's edge has to balance competing demands. It needs access to water, but must avoid flood-prone instability. It needs pasture, yet not at the expense of protection from wind or distance from cultivated ground. It must store food, repair textiles, maintain animals, and preserve mobility. It must bury its dead in places secure enough that the living can remember and return, but stable enough that the grave is not immediately destroyed by erosion, shifting sediment, or animal disturbance. Even burial is an environmental decision here. To bury someone in the Tarim Basin is to choose ground carefully, to work with dryness and elevation and local materials, and perhaps to understand, even without scientific language, that some places keep the body differently from others. The basin also reshapes time. In fertile river valleys, historical continuity often presents itself through visible urban accumulation walls rebuilt on walls, temples enlarged, palaces replaced by palaces, the Tarim Basin tells time differently. Its most enduring archive is often not the city but the margin. Not the monument towering over a population, but the grave set beside an old watercourse, or in a cemetery near an oasis community. Climatic fluctuation can move the centre of life from one zone to another. A once viable area can become barren, a river can abandon a settlement, a burial ground can remain while the living world around it collapses or shifts away. This produces a haunting archaeological pattern. The dead stay where they were placed, while the ecology that sustained them moves on. The basin becomes a museum of interrupted adaptation. This matters because the Tarim mummies are so often discussed as though they emerge from nowhere, as though the mystery begins with their bodies rather than with the environment that selected what would survive. In reality, the basin is an active participant in the story. It determines where people can settle, what they must wear, how they move, what they bury with the dead, and what remains legible to us thousands of years later. Without the basin's enclosure, there is less isolation. Without its aridity, there is less preservation. Without its unstable water systems, there is a different pattern of settlement and abandonment. Without its narrow ecological margins, there may be less need for the precise mixture of flexibility and continuity that appears to characterize the communities living here. There is also a psychological dimension to such a place. Human groups living on environmental frontiers often develop a powerful sense of threshold, even if we cannot recover the exact language they used for it. The desert center is not merely empty space. It is a risk zone, a source of fear, a barrier, perhaps a sacred or charged presence. Mountains are not just scenic backdrops. They are weather makers, route keepers, and walls against the known world. Oases are more than water points. They are pockets of possibility, sites where life condenses and therefore where social meanings thicken. A cemetery established in this setting is never just convenient ground. It sits within a geography already heavy with necessity and memory. Scholars still debate how environmental symbolism may have shaped specific Tarim burial practices, but no single explanation fully accounts for how consistently the landscape itself seems to structure both life and death in the basin. If the Tarim Basin had been wetter, the story would likely be much smaller. We might know only fragments of bone and scattered tools. We might never have seen the fabrics that changed early assumptions. We might never have recognized the unusual burial customs so clearly. We might not have had recoverable biological material good enough for the later genetic breakthroughs that transform the whole debate. Instead, the basin offers a near-perfect contradiction. It looks like a place built to obliterate human traces, yet it preserves them with stunning exactness. That contradiction lies at the heart of the mystery. A deadly environment becomes an archive. A region that seems peripheral becomes central to understanding Eurasian prehistory. So when the graves appear along these margins, they are not strange interruptions in an otherwise empty land. They are the natural consequence of a human geography shaped by mountains, snowmelt, salt, wind, and narrow survivable edges. The basin cuts people off, but not completely. It protects memory, but only in fragments. It allows communities to endure, but only under pressure, and because of all that, it creates one of the most revealing stages on Earth for a vanished population to leave behind its bodies, its craftsmanship, and eventually, buried deep within those preserved remains, a genetic signal from a human past far older than anyone first imagined. Long before the famous burials at Lulan, Xiaohe, or other Tarim Basin cemeteries begin to draw modern attention, the region is already part of a much older human drama. The desert may look timeless, but it is not. Its rivers shift, its margins expand and contract. Climatic pulses alter the boundaries between survivable and impossible ground, and with each environmental change, human presence in and around the basin changes too. The people who leave the best-known mummies do not step into an untouched world. They inherit landscapes already shaped by earlier movement, retreat, adaptation, and failure. To understand them properly, it helps to look beneath the spectacular preservation of the later dead and into the deeper, less visible story of how human beings approach this difficult interior in the first place. The farther back one goes, the more fragmentary the record becomes. Stone tools, scattered camps, traces of hunting, ephemeral occupation layers, and later pastoral or agricultural signals do not offer the same intimate clarity as a preserved body in a wool cloak. But they matter because they remind us that the Tarim Basin is not suddenly discovered in the Bronze Age. Human groups have been moving across the wider landscapes of Inner Asia for tens of thousands of years, responding to glacial cycles, changing grasslands, expanding deserts, and shifting corridors of movement. During colder periods, some routes become harder, others more attractive. During wetter phases, areas that later seem hopelessly barren may support broader ecological possibilities. The evidence remains incomplete, but what survives in the record suggests that the Tarim world has long been part of a wider zone of mobile, adaptive human presence, even when dense permanent settlement remains limited. This deeper past matters especially because the genetic mystery of the Tarim mummies cannot be solved by looking only at the Bronze Age surface. Later analysis will point toward ancestry rooted far older than the cemeteries themselves, perhaps linked to populations that once ranged across Ice Age northern Eurasia and then largely disappeared or were absorbed elsewhere. That does not mean the Tarim Basin is simply a frozen pocket of the Paleolithic left untouched for millennia. Human societies do not remain suspended in perfect cultural stillness. But it does mean that older population layers may persist in unexpected places, especially where geography restricts replacement and where survival depends less on empire-scale expansion than on local continuity in that sense. The basin is not just remote, it is conservative in the most literal demographic meaning. It can sometimes preserve lineages that more dynamic regions lose. At the same time, the early human history of the basin's margins is shaped by environmental instability severe enough to make any straightforward continuity unlikely. Water is everything here, and water in the Tarim world is never guaranteed. The rivers that descend from mountain snow and glacier do not create a stable, singular river civilization in the way the Nile or the lower Yellow River might. They disperse, vanish, shift channels, and feed temporary or fluctuating Iasis systems. Lakes expand and contract, marshes appear and disappear, habitable zones can migrate over generations. This means that even if a population persists in the broader region, the exact locations of camps, villages, and burial grounds may move repeatedly. The archaeological picture becomes a mosaic of local episodes rather than one neat line of development. Scholars still debate how continuous occupation really is in specific sectors of the basin, and no single explanation fully accounts for every gap or reappearance in the record. What does become clearer over time is that the Tarim Basin sits near multiple worlds without belonging entirely to any one of them. To the north and northwest lie steppe and mountain zones associated with herding, mobility, and long-distance movement. To the south and east are regions where agriculture develops different intensities and forms. To the west stretch corridors that eventually link to Central Asia and far beyond. The basin's earliest substantial communities therefore grow under the pressure of contact and separation at once. They do not emerge in cultural isolation from the beginning, nor are they merely passive recipients of innovations from elsewhere. Rather, they occupy a frontier where new ways of living can arrive in fragments: a crop here, an animal economy there, a weaving method, a burial habit, a tool form, a root knowledge system. The result is not imitation, but selective assembly. This is one reason the prehistory of the basin can feel elusive. There may never have been a single moment when the Tarim world becomes fully settled in the dramatic, irreversible way later histories sometimes prefer. Instead, there are thresholds crossed gradually. Hunter-gatherer movement gives way in some places to more regular seasonal use. Mobile herding intensifies. Cultivation appears on the margins where water permits it. Settlements become more durable in favourable pockets. Cemeteries begin to anchor memory to place. Wooden structures, textiles, and food remains hint at households that are no longer merely passing through. The transition is cumulative rather than theatrical, yet once it happens, it creates the conditions from which the famous mummified dead will eventually emerge, communities established enough to bury their members in formal cemeteries, but still living in a world where mobility, environmental alertness, and external contact remain essential. There is also a quieter and more surprising point here. Harsh landscapes are often imagined as marginal to human innovation, as though the important experiments in society always happen in richer lands first. But difficult frontiers can produce their own forms of sophistication. A group surviving on the edge of the Tarim Basin must solve problems of storage, insulation, transport, herd management, seasonal planning, and water use with remarkable consistency. It must know plants, roots, weather patterns, and the limits of local soils. It must maintain social ties strong enough to survive ecological shocks. It may need to exchange with outsiders while also protecting local continuity. In this sense, the deeper history of the basin is not merely about who arrives first. It is about what kinds of human organization can survive repeated environmental stress without vanishing entirely. That resilience, however, should not be mistaken for permanence. The basin preserves the dead beautifully, but it also preserves signs of disappearance. Some sites sit near channels that no longer flow. Some burial grounds outlast the communities that made them. Some local traditions seem to flourish, and then thin out or transform beyond easy recognition. The archaeological record is full of interruptions. This is important because the later mystery of ancestry must be held alongside a history of demographic fragility. A population can preserve ancient genetic signals not because it is large and dominant, but because it is small, local, and unexpectedly persistent in the right ecological niche. Such groups are often one drought, one root shift, or one wave of incoming neighbours away from transformation. What survives in the record suggests endurance, but endurance here is always conditional. By the time the famous Bronze Age cemeteries begin to appear, then the Tarim Basin is already the product of many older layers. There are inherited landscapes shaped by climate. There are human corridors tested over generations. There are adaptive strategies refined in response to scarcity. There are probably memories, myths, and territorial understandings now lost. But once central to how communities oriented themselves among oasis, dune, salt flat, and mountain wall. None of this survives in words. It survives indirectly, in where people choose to live, what they choose to raise and grow, how they bury their dead, and eventually in the ancient DNA that reveals connections far older than the visible culture alone would suggest. This deeper timescale also protects the story from one of its most common misunderstandings. The Tarim mummies are sometimes treated as a historical anomaly, a bizarre insertion into the wrong place, as though the Basin suddenly received an inexplicable foreign population and then froze them for modern fascination. The longer prehistory suggests something subtler and much more interesting. The Basin is not the wrong place. It is exactly the kind of place where older population histories can persist in altered form, where incoming ideas can be adopted without complete biological replacement, and where the visible surface of culture can conceal far deeper roots. The mystery is not that such people existed there. The mystery is how long their deeper ancestry endured, and how thoroughly the desert concealed that fact until modern science forced the question open. So before the preserved dead begin to dominate the narrative, there is already another story under their feet, one of Ice Age legacies, unstable waters, gradual settlement, and repeated adaptation along the margins of one of the hardest inhabited landscapes in Eurasia. The graves do not stand at the beginning of the tale. They stand at a point where much older histories briefly become visible. The bodies are late evidence of a longer process, one that stretches back into a human past where movement is constant, survival is local, and whole branches of ancestry may endure for thousands of years without leaving the kinds of monuments later civilizations prefer. In the Tarim Basin, that older world does not announce itself with walls or inscriptions. It waits in the ground, beneath cemeteries of the famous dead, in a silence older than the desert routes that would one day carry silk, horses, merchants, and empires across the edges of the same unforgiving land. By the time the graves themselves come fully into view, the Tarim mystery changes shape. Faces and textiles can still seduce the imagination, and the Basin's brutal geography still hangs over every interpretation. But now the evidence becomes more deliberate. A cemetery is not an accident. It is a social statement arranged in wood, earth, body position, offerings, and repeated pattern. It tells us not only that people lived here, but that they remembered one another, sorted the dead according to rules, and returned often enough to make burial a structured part of community life. The famous cemeteries of the Tarim Basin, especially places like Xiaohe, do not look like improvised resting places at the edge of survival. They look ceremonial, intentional, and unlike anything that fits comfortably into a familiar neighbouring template. This is where the dead stop being merely preserved and begin to reveal a cultural world that is harder to classify than many early theories allowed. Some of these burial grounds are visually startling even before one considers the bodies within them. Coffins are shaped and arranged in unusual forms. Wooden posts rise from the sand. Grave markers and surrounding features create a landscape of ritual that feels at once stark and highly coded. At Xiaohe, for example, the cemetery becomes one of the most haunting sights in Bronze Age Eurasia, not because it is grand in the urban sense, but because it is so isolated, so deliberate, and so symbolically charged. The dead are placed in boat-shaped coffins in a desert with no sea. Upright wooden poles stand above graves, some interpreted as gendered symbols, though scholars still debate the exact meaning and the evidence remains incomplete. The whole site has the quality of a constructed threshold, a place set apart from ordinary habitation and arranged according to rules that were once obvious to those who built it, but are now only partially legible to us. That boat form has understandably attracted attention. It is tempting to treat it as evidence of migration from some water-focused culture, or as a symbolic survival of lost wetlands and vanished lakes. Perhaps it reflects cosmological ideas about crossing into death. Perhaps it encodes a memory of movement over water or marsh. Perhaps it's a practical coffin design later invested with meaning. No single explanation fully accounts for it, and that uncertainty is important. The Tarim Basin is a region where environments changed, water systems shifted, and communities may well have remembered landscapes that no longer existed in the same form. But symbolism is notoriously difficult to reconstruct when language is gone. What can be said more firmly is that these burials are not random. The coffin shape, the grave architecture, and the repeated use of striking markers suggest a ritual tradition with its own strong internal logic. The arrangement of bodies deepens that impression. Some are wrapped or dressed in ways that imply care beyond mere disposal. Objects placed with them include textiles, baskets, tools, food remains, ephedra twigs in certain cases, and items whose exact purpose remains uncertain. The inclusion of plant materials is especially evocative because in such a dry environment, botanical remains can survive where they would disappear elsewhere. Scholars have proposed ritual, medicinal, symbolic, or practical interpretations for some of these deposits. The presence of ephedra, for instance, has generated much discussion because the plant has stimulant and medicinal properties and appears in other ancient cultural contexts. Yet the exact meaning of its use in Tarim burials remains debated. It is one of those details that feels almost too suggestive, a small surviving clue that hints at a ceremonial world just beyond recovery. Then there are the poles, rising above the graves, often stark against the sand. They make the cemetery look less like a field of burials than a forest of symbols. Some are narrow and tapering, others are broader or shaped differently. Early interpretations emphasize sexual symbolism, connecting certain forms to male and female graves, fertility, lineage, or reproductive continuity. These readings are plausible in broad terms. Many ancient societies link death and regeneration closely, and in a fragile oasis, world fertility would hardly be a trivial concept. But here caution matters. Visual resemblance does not guarantee ritual meaning, and even if such symbolism is present, it may not exhaust the purpose of the markers. They may indicate status, clan, household, office, ancestry, cosmological direction, or some combination now lost. What survives in the record suggests a cemetery language, but not a dictionary. This is where the Tarim burials become truly difficult to fit into simple diffusionist models. If these people were merely settlers transplanted from some better-known Western Bronze Age society, why do their cemeteries look so distinct in structure and symbolism? If they were simply local populations adopting a few outside goods, why do the burial assemblages display such complex and repeated forms? The answer may be that both assumptions are too crude. The graves imply a community that has developed its own ritual grammar under local conditions, while drawing selectively from wider horizons of material life. That combination of uniqueness and connectivity will become a recurring pattern throughout the Tarim story. The people buried here are not archaeologically invisible, but neither are they reducible to any one neighbouring world. Even the placement of the cemetery within its surrounding environment matters. A burial ground in the Tarim Basin is never just a convenient patch of sand. It is chosen in relation to former water sources, inhabitable zones, and perhaps ancestral claims. Some sites today seem impossibly remote, but that remoteness can mislead. The ancient environment may have been somewhat different, with water, marsh, or habitable margins nearer than they appear now. Over centuries, rivers wander and lakes shrink, leaving cemeteries stranded in landscapes that exaggerate their isolation. This creates one of the strangest effects in Tarim archaeology ritual sites that now look like they belong to a world of pure desert may once have stood near the edge of living ecological systems. Death remains fixed. The living landscape moves away. The craftsmanship of the grave goods also speaks quietly but forcefully. These are not impoverished edge burials in the sense of cultural thinness. The textiles alone indicate labour investment, technical control, and access to valued fibres. Wooden structures require tools, planning, and timber, which in this environment is never a trivial resource. Leather goods reflect animal economies and tanning knowledge. Baskets and other containers hint at storage, transport, and domestic activity. Each grave compresses a network of skills: herding, gathering, carpentry, weaving, sewing, perhaps trade, certainly memory. Burial draws the whole community into focus because the dead go to the grave clothed in the achievements of the living. There is also a social puzzle hidden in the repetition of burial forms. Repetition means convention, and convention implies continuity. This is not one eccentric burial performed by one family in one season. It is a structured cemetery tradition maintained over time. That suggests a community stable enough to reproduce ritual knowledge across generations, even in a landscape where life is always vulnerable to ecological stress. It suggests elders, specialists, or at least shared norms powerful enough to govern how death is handled. It suggests that identity here is not fragile in the everyday sense, even if the population itself may later prove demographically unusual. The graves project confidence. They say that the people who made them knew where they belonged, even if modern observers struggle to place them. Popular imagination often turns these cemeteries into exotic curiosities, emphasizing how eerie or alien they appear. But the deeper truth is more human and more unsettling. These graves are not mysterious because they are incomprehensible spectacles. They are mysterious because they are coherent expressions of a world whose inner meanings are mostly gone. The boat coffins, the poles, the wrapped bodies, the plants, the textiles, the careful arrangement of the dead, all of it belongs together. The challenge is not to marvel at disconnected oddities, but to recognize that this is a complete mortuary language surviving in fragments. We possess its nouns, perhaps some of its verbs, but almost none of its grammar. And that missing grammar matters because burial is one of the clearest windows into what a people think the human person is. To bury someone in a particular way is to assert something about memory, relation, body, and afterlife, even when those assertions are never written down. The Tarim cemeteries therefore reveal more than local custom. They reveal a community with a structured sense of the dead and their place among the living. Whether that structure centers on ancestry, fertility, cosmology, territory, or some blend of all four remains debated, but no single explanation fully accounts for the density of symbolic choice present in these sites. The graves are not only preserving bodies, they are preserving intention. So as the cemeteries rise from the desert record, the mystery deepens rather than narrows. The dead are no longer just strangely preserved people with arresting faces. They are members of a society that builds ritual landscapes unlike those of its obvious neighbours, a society capable of continuity, symbolic complexity, and technical skill in one of the hardest environments on Earth. The burials do not tell us exactly who these people are, but they do tell us that whoever they were not culturally thin, not merely passing through, and not waiting to be explained by someone else's civilization. They had already built a world of their own, and the desert, for once, chose not to erase it. Once the graves have shown that these communities possess a ritual life of unusual coherence, the quieter evidence of daily existence begins to matter even more. a people can bury their dead in dramatic ways and still leave only a thin impression of how they actually lived. But in the Tarim Basin, the desert preserves enough fragments of ordinary material life to make that world feel unexpectedly textured. Wool fibers, leather, woven baskets, wooden objects, food residues, plant remains, and traces of animal use all suggest that survival here is not improvised from day to day. It is organized. It is practiced. It depends on a careful blending of mobility and settlement, on knowing which resources can be trusted, which cannot, and how to build continuity in a place where continuity is always under pressure. Clothing is one of the clearest clues. The garments buried with the dead are not ornamental in any shallow sense. They are responses to climate, movement, labour, and perhaps rank. But they are also evidence of a society that has mastered fibre production in detail. Wool must come from herded animals, sorted, cleaned, spun, and woven. Felt requires a different technique, one that works fibres through moisture, heat, and pressure into dense insulating material. Leather demands yet another chain of knowledge, raising or obtaining animals, skinning, treating hides, softening them, shaping them, sewing them, in a basin of sharp seasonal contrasts, where cold can be severe and wind relentless. Clothing is not a superficial marker of culture. It is infrastructure. It is portable shelter, social signal, and stored labour all at once. The sophistication of these textiles strongly suggests that the people of the Tarim cemeteries are not marginal in any simplistic sense. They may live at the edge of one of the harshest deserts in Eurasia, but their technical knowledge is substantial. Their woven fabrics show pattern, control, and material investment. Their hats and cloaks seem designed not only for warmth, but for identity. Some garments indicate layered dressing, implying an understanding of insulation suited to fluctuating conditions. Footwear matters just as much. Shoes and boots in this environment must deal with coarse ground, salt, cold, and long movement across unstable surfaces. What survives in the record suggests lives spent in active negotiation with the land, not passive endurance. These are people adapted to harshness so thoroughly that adaptation becomes visible in every surviving seam. Food, too, begins to sketch the outlines of a demanding but resourceful economy. Archaeological evidence from the broader Tarim context points toward communities using a mixture of farming and herding, though the balance likely varies across time and place. Crops such as wheat, barley, and millet eventually appear in this wider world, and their presence is especially telling because they come from different agricultural traditions. Wheat and barley have origins farther west. Millet is more strongly associated with East Asian agricultural systems. Their appearance together in Inner Asian context hints at remarkable pattern. The Basin's communities are not sealed off from Eurasian exchange, even when the people themselves may remain locally distinct. This is one of the first strong signs that isolation in the Tarim Basin is never absolute. Ideas and organisms travel even when populations do not merge completely. The mixed food world would have demanded careful management. Farming in the Tarim margins is not like farming in a broad, stable river valley. Water availability can change sharply. Salinity can damage fields. Wind and shifting sediment threaten exposed ground. Productive cultivation depends on timing, local hydrology, and constant attention to place. Herding offers flexibility, but it also requires pasture, seasonal movement, and protection against loss. A household or community that combines both agriculture and animal husbandry is not merely diversifying out of convenience, it is building resilience. One resource can fail, another might endure. The dead, with their wool textiles and plant remains beside them, seem to belong to such a blended economy. Scholars still debate the exact proportions and local variations, but no single explanation fully accounts for the survivability of Tarim communities without assuming this kind of practical flexibility. The animals behind that world matter as much as the crops. Sheep seem especially important, not only for meat but for wool and perhaps for the structuring of pastoral life itself. Other livestock may also have played roles depending on period and location, but sheep fit the archaeological and environmental picture particularly well. Mobile, adaptable, useful for fibre, food, and hide. A society invested in sheep is a society invested in seasonal knowledge. Flocks must be moved, watched, bred, protected, and integrated into household rhythms. Their products then move into clothing, burial goods, and storage economies. When one looks at a preserved wool garment in a Tarim grave, one is also seeing grazing decisions, lambing cycles, shearing work, spinning labour, and accumulated ecological judgment. There are smaller clues too, and these often feel the most intimate. Baskets imply gathering, carrying, storing, and sorting. Wooden objects imply carpentry in a land where usable timber must be deliberately obtained and valued. Cordage implies repair, fastening, transport, and craft traditions too humble to attract grand narratives but essential to every day of survival. Plant remains can suggest diet, medicinal practice, fodder use, or ritual behaviour. Even where interpretation remains uncertain, the sheer variety of preserved materials tells its own story. These people do not live in a cultural thin zone. They live in a materially articulate world where many skills intersect, and where the dryness of the basin happens to preserve evidence of those skills with unusual kindness. This daily life is easy to misread if one imagines oasis communities as static and self-contained. They are not. Life on the Tarim margins almost certainly involves movement at several scales. Some members of a community may tend fields near relatively stable settlement zones, while others range farther with animals. Trade or exchange journeys may connect one oasis to another. Raw materials unavailable locally must be acquired somehow. Knowledge itself travels along these routes. How to process a crop, how to weave a pattern, how to treat illness, how to orient across dunes or find water when a familiar source fails. The people buried in these cemeteries may appear fixed in death, but the living world they belong to is one of circulation. Even stillness here depends on movement elsewhere. And yet this mobility should not be confused with rootlessness. The repeated burial traditions, the continuity of material practice, and the environmental demands of the region all point towards strong local identity. Communities return to the same burial grounds. They maintain recognizable craft habits. They build domestic and symbolic life from the same narrow band of survivable resources. In a basin like this, local knowledge is too valuable to discard lightly. A spring, a seasonal route, a patch of cultivable land, a sheltered camp, a stand of useful trees, a tradition for coping with dust storms or winter exposure. These are forms of inheritance no less important than ancestry. The dead of the Tarim cemeteries are wrapped not only in cloth, but in accumulated knowledge about how to remain human in a place that could so easily strip life down to desperation. There is also the matter of beauty, which can seem secondary until one remembers how often difficult societies invest meaning in what is well made. Patterned textiles, carefully prepared clothing, and the deliberate arrangement of bodies in burial suggest that utility alone does not govern this world. A woven object can be practical and beautiful at once. A hat can protect against cold and mark belonging. A cloak can warm the body and carry status or memory. This matters because it reminds us that harsh environments do not reduce people to bare survival. They often sharpen the significance of form. When resources are limited, what is carefully made matters more, not less. The people of the Tarim Basin seem to have understood that deeply. So daily life along the desert's edge emerges as a choreography of skill. Animals must be managed, fibres must be spun, fields must be watched, food must be stored, water must be anticipated, wood must be shaped, the dead must be clothed and buried. Children must be taught the roots and rhythms that make continuity possible. The evidence remains incomplete, as it always does. But what survives in the record suggests communities of discipline rather than accident, of technical competence rather than improvisational luck. Their world is constrained, but not impoverished in human terms. It is severe, but also richly structured by labour, memory, and adaptation. This is what makes the Tarim mystery harder and more compelling. By the time genetic evidence eventually reveals how unusual some of these people are in ancestry, the cultural picture is already clear enough to rule out a simple caricature. These are not isolated relics frozen outside history. They are participants in a demanding and connected Bronze Age world. They herd, weave, bury, travel, plant, store, and remember. They borrow what is useful and preserve what is theirs. They survive not because the basin is kind, but because they have learned how to turn its narrow possibilities into a durable way of life. And in that durability lies the next puzzle. Because once such a people has become visible in daily detail, the obvious question follows with greater force than ever where, exactly, did they come from? Once the daily life of the Tarim communities begins to come into focus, the first major explanatory theory almost writes itself. The clothing looks familiar in certain ways. Some of the bodies seem, to modern observers, to possess features more often associated with Western Eurasian populations. The textiles show techniques with broad parallels to traditions known farther west. Wheat and barley appear in the wider cultural picture. The basin itself sits at the eastern edge of a vast inner Asian world that would later carry goods, languages, and peoples across astonishing distances. Put these elements together, and for many years the dominant instinct is clear: the Tarim mummies must be descendants of migrants who moved eastward from Western steppe or Western Eurasian populations, bringing their appearance, some of their technologies, and perhaps their deeper cultural identity with them. This idea gains force not only because it seems plausible, but because it satisfies a particular historical appetite. It offers direction, it offers familiarity. It turns a strange and difficult archaeological record into a story of expansion, migration, and diffusion that scholars already know how to tell. The dead in the desert become outliers only in geography, not in ancestry. They are imagined as settlers or descendants of settlers from beyond the mountains, perhaps linked to Bronze Age herding peoples of the steppe, perhaps to populations farther west still. Their unusual faces cease to be a puzzle and become confirmation. Their textiles become breadcrumbs. Their burial distinctiveness can be explained away as local variation emerging after migration into a harsh environment. It is a theory with enough flexibility to absorb many details and enough simplicity to spread far beyond specialist debate. In broad outline, there are reasons this interpretation seems reasonable. The Bronze Age is full of movement across Eurasia. Pastoralist groups associated with horse use, mobile herding, wheeled transport, and expansive cultural networks spread through huge portions of the steppe and adjacent zones. Technologies, animals, crops, and perhaps languages move with or among them. Archaeologists have long recognized that the eastern reaches of Inner Asia are not sealed from these developments. Material traits with western or steppe affinities do appear across great distances. In that context, finding a population in the Tarim Basin with western-looking textiles and striking physical features does not seem outlandish. It seems like part of a known pattern, only unusually well preserved. And there is another layer. Before ancient DNA becomes central to the story, physical anthropology places heavy weight on bodily form, cranial measurements, facial proportions, and other morphological observations are used to infer relationships between ancient populations. These methods are not worthless, but they are far less definitive than they are sometimes treated. Still, in the earlier phases of Tarim research, they help reinforce the impression that these mummies belong within a Western Eurasian frame. Popular accounts go even further, often with much less caution than the underlying scholarship. The preserved bodies are turned into visual proof of eastward migration, sometimes described in sweeping and careless racial terms. A body with a narrow nose and well-preserved hair becomes, in public imagination, almost self-explanatory. The face is mistaken for a map. The first big theory is also strengthened by language history, though here the logic becomes much more dangerous, because later historical sources attest Indo-European languages in parts of the broader Tarim region, especially the so-called Tocharian languages preserved in manuscripts from the first millennium CE. It becomes tempting to project that linguistic evidence backward onto the Bronze Age mummies. If later Indo-European speakers are known in the region, and if the mummies look Western to modern eyes, then perhaps the mummies are early Tocharians or close relatives. This is an elegant idea, and elegance can be a trap. Languages do not remain fixed to one biological population forever. A language spoken in a region many centuries later does not automatically identify the ancestry of earlier burial populations. Scholars have long understood this in principle, yet the temptation remains strong because it ties bodily appearance, textiles, and historical language into one satisfying arc. For a time, that arc dominates much of the public imagination, and a fair amount of scholarly framing as well. The Tarim mummies become symbols of long-distance migration from west to east, sometimes cast as evidence of an almost civilizational drift across Eurasia. In more exaggerated versions, they are made to stand for the idea that major innovations in the East must have come from the West. In more careful versions, they are simply treated as one eastern branch of a wider Bronze Age Western-derived population movement. Either way, the mystery feels close to resolution. The cemetery oddities can be explained as local development. The wool and felt fit a mobile pastoral or mixed agropastoral background. The bodily form fits the expected ancestry. The desert has merely preserved a chapter of Eurasian expansion in unusual clarity. But even while this theory is gaining strength, the record continues to resist full assimilation. The cemeteries do not map neatly onto known steppe traditions. The ritual architecture remains stubbornly distinctive. The combination of a local adaptation and broader material links feels more complicated than simple colonization. Some of the populations that would be expected as close parallels are not quite right in chronology, in burial form, or in ecological setting. The Tarim communities seem both connected and self-contained in ways that the migration model does not fully explain. Scholars still debate exactly which Western or steppe populations, if any, offer the best comparison, and the evidence remains incomplete. No single explanation fully accounts for why the people in these graves appear at once familiar from afar and unique on the ground. There is also a methodological issue buried inside the theory. When a population appears visually surprising in a given region, scholars can become too eager to explain it through movement from elsewhere, rather than by asking whether the region itself has a deeper and more complex population history than expected. In other words, it may be easier to import an explanation than to expand the map. The Tarim Basin, long seen as a remote margin between better-known worlds, is especially vulnerable to this habit. If something unexpected appears there, many assume it must have arrived from a more central historical zone. But peripheral regions are often precisely where older demographic layers survive, where multiple influences intersect, and where cultural uniqueness develops most clearly. The first big theory, for all its plausibility, partly reflects the gravitational pull of older scholarly habits. Even so, it would be unfair to treat the theory as foolish. It is an earnest attempt to make sense of powerful evidence using the best frameworks available at the time. Researchers are working with textiles, burial forms, physical appearance, regional comparisons, and emerging understandings of Eurasian Bronze Age mobility. From that vantage point, an eastward-western origin explanation is not fringe. It is mainstream, grounded, and in some respects still partly compatible with later findings about cultural contact. The problem is not that it notices Western connections. The problem is that it notices them too quickly and lets them do too much explanatory work. It treats resemblance as ancestry, ancestry as identity, and identity as destiny, all before the hardest evidence has spoken. That hardest evidence will eventually come from ancient DNA, and when it does, it will not merely adjust the theory, it will overturn its core expectation. The people in the Tarim graves will turn out not to be straightforward descendants of the Western steppe populations many had imagined, nor will they fit neatly as migrants freshly arrived from any familiar Bronze Age Western source. Instead, their ancestry will point somewhere older, stranger, and much deeper in time, toward a population history that seems almost ghost-like by the Bronze Age world they inhabit. Yet this future reversal only has its full force because the first theory is so understandable. The surprise matters precisely because expectations are not irrational. They are coherent. They just happen to be wrong in the most revealing way. So the first big theory stands as an important stage in the story, not merely as an error to be discarded. It shows how compelling the visible evidence is. It shows how archaeology before genetics built explanation from bodies, textiles, landscapes, and analogy. It shows how easily later languages and modern assumptions can be projected backward onto silent graves. And it shows how the Tarim mummies, from the moment they entered modern consciousness, were never going to remain just a local puzzle. They were always going to become a test case for bigger questions about migration, identity, and how much of the human past can really be read from appearance alone. The desert, meanwhile, remains indifferent. The same dry ground that preserved woven cloth and human hair has also preserved the conditions for misunderstanding. It keeps evidence long enough for each generation to ask its own version of the same question, then answer too soon. The first answer is elegant and plausible. Western-looking dead must come from Western peoples. For a while, that seems enough. Then the genomes are opened, and the old certainty begins to collapse, not into confusion, but into a far more interesting kind of truth. The great reversal begins in silence, in laboratories far removed from the salt flats and dead river channels where the bodies first emerge. For years the Tarim mummies have been looked at more than listened to. Their faces dominate the discussion. Their clothes guide the first assumptions. Their cemetery forms complicate those assumptions but do not destroy them. Then ancient DNA enters the story, and does what genetics so often does to archaeology. It keeps some of the visible world intact while quietly dismantling the explanation built around it. The dead, who have already survived the desert for millennia, now survive a second kind of burial beneath modern expectation. When their genomes are finally studied in detail, they do not confirm the most popular narrative. They break it open. At first glance, one might expect the results to show what many had long assumed: strong links to Bronze Age steppe herders from farther west, or perhaps to populations moving eastward through Inner Asia and leaving descendants in the Tarim Basin. After all, the material clues seem to point in that direction. There are textiles with broader Western parallels. There are bodily features that earlier observers describe in strikingly Western terms. There are crops and cultural forms in the wider region that imply contact across long distances. If ancient DNA were simply going to ratify the first big theory, this would be the moment. Instead, the evidence reveals something far less convenient and much more remarkable. The Tarim Basin individuals studied from the early Bronze Age do not look like a simple extension of those Western steppe populations. They do not match the expected profile of recently arrived migrants from the pastoral expansion zones that had been used to explain them. Nor do they appear as a straightforward blend dominated by familiar neighbouring Bronze Age groups. Their ancestry points towards something older, more isolated, and by the time of their burials, already deeply unusual. The signal that emerges is tied to what geneticists call ancient North Eurasian ancestry, a lineage associated with populations that once existed across parts of northern Eurasia during the Ice Age and afterward, but that in most later populations survives only as a diluted component, mixed into many descendants and rarely, if ever, preserved in anything like this concentrated form. That is the shock at the heart of the Tarim story. These people are not simply Western steppe intruders preserved in Chinese desert sand. They appear to descend largely from a population base that is itself a kind of surviving echo from a much older world. In a Bronze Age setting full of movement, mixture, and expanding horizons, the Tarim mummies carry the genetic weight of deep ancestry that by then has largely vanished elsewhere as a distinct population signature. They are, in this sense, biological survivors of a population history that most of Eurasia has already absorbed, transformed, or erased. Scholars still debate the exact demographic pathway that led to this outcome, but no single explanation fully accounts for how such ancestry remains so prominent here while becoming so muted elsewhere. It is hard to overstate how strongly this changes the terms of the mystery. Before genetics, the question is mostly directional. Did these people come from west or east? After genetics, the question becomes temporal as much as geographical. How did an ancestry pattern rooted in populations of deep prehistory remain so visible in a Bronze Age oasis society? How did a people living among flows of technology, crops, and perhaps neighbouring populations manage to remain so genetically distinct? Why does the basin preserve not just bodies and textiles, but a demographic relic from a world thousands of years older than their burials? The old map does not merely need editing, it needs a different logic. To understand the significance, it helps to remember that ancient ancestry is not the same as living identity. The Tarim people of the Bronze Age are not Ice Age hunters frozen in time. Their culture is clearly Bronze Age. Their burial practices are structured and local. Their economy includes crops, herding, craft specialization, and participation in a wider exchange networks. They are people of their own era, not cultural fossils, but genetically. They seem to preserve a lineage that had become rare as a distinct profile in surrounding populations. This is what makes the discovery so unsettling and so powerful. It separates biology from the visible assumptions that had dominated earlier debate. A population can wear borrowed textiles, use foreign crops, and inhabit a connected world without being recently replaced or defined by the ancestry outsiders expect. The phrase that these mummies had DNA from no known population on Earth is dramatic, and like many dramatic phrases, it requires care. It does not mean they are alien, impossible, or unrelated to the rest of humanity. It means something more interesting. Their genetic profile does not match any known living population as a direct equivalent, and their ancestry reflects an ancient lineage that survives elsewhere only in mixed and reduced traces. They are not beyond human classification. They are evidence that later human history has simplified what was once more varied. The living world does not preserve every branch in equal form. Some are thinned, some absorbed, some vanish almost entirely, and some endure in isolated pockets long enough to surprise the future. There is a strange irony here. The bodies had encouraged an overly visual story about migration from the West. The genomes reveal a much less superficial kind of Westernness, if that word can even still be used carefully at all. Their deeper ancestry does connect to ancient northern Eurasian populations that once occupied landscapes stretching across wide parts of the continent. But this is not the same as saying they are descendants of the specific Bronze Age Western migrants many had in mind. The connection is older than that and more diffuse in time. It belongs to an ancient population layer, not to the simple transfer of a known historic people from one region to another. The desert mummies do not confirm a familiar migration tale. They preserve a relic ancestry that survived into a later cultural world. This is where the Tarim Basin's geography returns to the center of the story. A region enclosed by mountains, punctuated by difficult oasis zones, and hostile to large-scale settlement expansion, can act as a kind of demographic shelter. Not a shelter from hardship, certainly, but a shelter from full replacement. Small communities can persist where larger state-level systems do not yet sweep through. Local endogamy, ecological specialization, and relative isolation can preserve ancestry patterns that would be blurred elsewhere by constant mixture. At the same time, contact remains possible along the margins, allowing the adoption of crops, techniques, and perhaps ideas without requiring heavy gene flow. The evidence remains incomplete on the exact social mechanisms, but the basin appears to have allowed a rare combination cultural permeability paired with substantial biological continuity. The DNA results therefore solve one problem only by generating several more. If the Tarim mummies are not primarily descended from the expected Western Bronze Age migrants, why do some aspects of their material culture look so connected to wider Western worlds? How exactly did wheat and barley enter their economy? How much interaction did they have with neighbouring groups in the Dzungarian Basin, Central Asia, or farther east? Why do they remain genetically distinct while still participating in a clearly connected Bronze Age environment? The answer begins to emerge in outline. People do not have to intermarry heavily to exchange things. A crop can travel without a population replacement. Textile knowledge can move through contact, imitation, apprenticeship, or intermediaries. Technologies and ideas can spread faster than genes, and genes can remain local even when the world around them is not. This is one of the most important lessons the Tarim mummies offer. Archaeology had once looked at visible features and inferred ancestry. Genetics then corrected ancestry, but could not by itself explain culture. The full picture requires both, and even then much remains uncertain. What survives in the record suggests a population that is locally rooted in unusually ancient ancestry, yet culturally entangled with surrounding regions. that combination is not a contradiction. It is the real history. Humans are perfectly capable of being demographically conservative and culturally opportunistic at the same time. A community can keep marrying largely within itself while adopting new foods, techniques, and styles from outside. In fact, in difficult environments, that may be one of the most effective strategies available. So the laboratory result does more than replace one origin story with another. It restores complexity to people who had been flattened by first impressions. Their faces no longer function as easy evidence. Their clothes no longer dictate their ancestry. Their graves no longer fit a borrowed script. Instead, the Tarim mummies emerge as members of a Bronze Age society built on an ancestry profile already ancient in their own time, preserved by geography and local continuity, and yet visibly linked to broader Eurasian worlds through culture and subsistence. The mystery has changed from a tale of obvious migrants to something more haunting, a surviving population ghost from deep prehistory living fully in a later age. And that is why this moment feels like the true turning point of the whole story. The desert had kept the bodies, archaeology had kept the questions alive. But ancient DNA reveals that beneath the wool, beneath the boat-shaped coffins, beneath the preserved hair and weathered faces, there is a deeper archive still, not a lost civilization in the extravagant sense, and not a people beyond explanation, but a human lineage that reminds us how much of the ancient world has been compressed by time. We do not descend from one clean map. We descend from a crowded past full of branches, mergers, disappearances, and survivals. In the Tarim Basin, one of those older branches lasted long enough to bury its dead with dignity, vanish from memory, and then return carrying a genetic signature the modern world no longer knows how to recognize at a glance. Once the genetic evidence has overturned the first easy explanation, the Tarim mummies begin to resemble something far stranger than migrants preserved in transit. They begin to look like survivors from an older human map, a branch that should, by the logic of later population history, have long since dissolved into other peoples. The phrase ancient North Eurasian can sound technical and bloodless, but behind it lies one of the most haunting realities in all of prehistory. There were once human populations spread across northern Eurasia, whose genetic legacy survives today only in fragments, diluted into later groups across Europe, Siberia, the Americas, and parts of Asia. Their descendants did not vanish completely, but the populations themselves, as distinct entities, mostly did. What the Tarim genome suggests is that in this desert basin, among Bronze Age people living in felt and wool and burying their dead in carefully built cemeteries, one of those old signals endured with a clarity almost nowhere else seen. This does not mean the Tarim people are direct replicas of Ice Age foragers walking unchanged through thousands of years. Human societies do not preserve themselves like insects in amber. Cultures transform, economies shift, and technologies accumulate. The people of the Tarim Basin are clearly participants in a later world. They herd animals, use crops, wear sophisticated textiles, and build ritual landscapes that belong to the Bronze Age, not the Paleolithic. Yet their ancestry seems to reach down into a much deeper layer of Eurasian history, into populations that once occupied cold northern environments, and then, through later migrations and mixtures, lose their distinctness across most of the continent. The Tarim communities are not ancient in a simple sense. They are ancient in their roots and modern, for their time, in everything they do with those roots. That is why they feel almost ghost-like in the genetic record. They are present, embodied, and fully alive in their own era. but from the perspective of later history they carry something that should already have become difficult to isolate. A demographic echo survives inside a Bronze Age world. Scholars still debate how exactly this happens. Perhaps the Basin receives descendants of older populations during earlier movements, and then preserves them under unusually stable local conditions. Perhaps neighbouring regions undergo so much later turnover that the contrast only looks stronger in hindsight. Perhaps the environmental and social structure of Tarim life allows communities to remain reproductively closed enough to conserve deep ancestry while still remaining culturally open. No single explanation fully accounts for every part of the pattern, but the broad implication is clear. The Tarim Basin has become a refuge not for static culture, but for persistent lineage. The word refuge, however, should not be romanticized. This is not a green sanctuary where people drift in and live easily apart from the storms of history. It is a hard refuge, the kind difficult places sometimes provide: high mountains, shifting rivers, desert barriers, and oasis dependence can limit mass replacement not because they are gentle, but because they are punishing. Only certain kinds of movement are possible. Only certain settlement forms can last. Only communities with strong environmental knowledge can remain rooted. In such settings, population continuity may survive precisely because the cost of entering and fully taking over the niche is so high. The Tarim Basin preserves by demanding too much. It filters human history through scarcity, and sometimes scarcity protects what abundance would erase. There is something almost perverse about that logic. The same landscape that narrows human possibility may also lengthen memory. A rich corridor with easy movement attracts newcomers, conquests, markets, intermarriage, and demographic turnover. A difficult margin can hold older patterns longer, not because it is central, but because it is not. The people living there still change, still borrow, still adapt, but the core population may remain more stable than outsiders expect. This may be one reason the Tarim mummies unsettle broader narratives of Eurasian prehistory. They remind us that demographic history is not driven only by expansion and replacement. Sometimes it is driven by pockets of improbable persistence. Ancient North Eurasian ancestry itself has a curious afterlife in science. It appears in traces across far-flung populations and has long been recognized as an important component in reconstructing prehistoric movements, especially those involving Siberia and the peopling of the Americas. But usually it appears as part of a blend, one ancestral ingredient among several. In the Tarim Basin, what is so striking is not that this lineage exists at all, but that it appears in a form so comparatively concentrated and isolated. It is as though a background element of Eurasian prehistory has suddenly stepped into the foreground. A layer usually glimpsed through later admixture becomes, here, a dominant signal. For geneticists, that is extraordinary. For historians, it is almost poetic. A population history mostly known through traces is found embodied in people who were once dismissed based on how they looked. The deeper irony is that the Tarim mummies had seemed to belong to a story of motion. Western-looking features suggested arrival. Borrowed-looking textiles suggested transfer. Crops from different agricultural worlds suggested active connection. All of that remains true in cultural terms, yet the ancestry beneath it speaks of endurance more than movement. These people may inhabit a crossroads, but their genes point toward a long local persistence of something older. The crossroads does not erase them. It flows around them, through them, beside them, but not entirely into them. What survives in the record suggests a society positioned at the edge of many worlds while still retaining an ancestry profile that those wider worlds have largely transformed beyond recognition. This creates a useful warning for the broader study of prehistory. When modern observers see a connected landscape, they often assume connected populations. When they see shared technologies, they infer shared descent. When they see familiar physical traits, they imagine recent migration. But the Tarim case shows how badly these instincts can mislead. Human history contains many different clocks running at once. Cultural exchange may move quickly. Crops and techniques can spread within generations. Styles can be borrowed in years. Gene flow may remain limited for centuries. Deep ancestry can outlast visible cultural boundaries, while visible cultural forms can change without demographic replacement. The Tarim mummies force all those clocks onto the table at once. There is, too, a more unsettling philosophical implication. Whole populations can survive for millennia and then disappear so thoroughly that no living group preserves them in direct recognizable form. Not annihilation in the dramatic sense, but absorption, fragmentation, or demographic thinning so complete that only ancient DNA can reconstruct the outline. The Tarim mummies are a reminder that the human past is full of such partial disappearances. Many peoples did not fail spectacularly. They simply became someone else over time, or were outnumbered, or were folded into larger demographic currents until their distinctness ceased to register. What makes the Tarim case remarkable is that the desert happened to preserve both the bodies and enough genetic material for us to notice the process. Even then, caution remains necessary. Ancient DNA is powerful, but it does not speak in a complete human voice. It can reveal ancestry, relatedness, population structure, and broad demographic history. It cannot tell us what myths these people told, what names they used for themselves, or how they understood their own origins. A community preserving ancient North Eurasian ancestry does not necessarily think of itself as ancient, separate, or unusual. It may simply think of itself as local, proper, ancestral, or ordinary. The evidence remains incomplete because identity is never reducible to lineage. Yet lineage still matters because it preserves one dimension of the human story otherwise lost. In the Tarim Basin, that dimension opens a window onto a vanished world older than the cemeteries, older than the crops, older than the textiles, older even than the ritual poles standing above the graves. So the mummies become ghosts of an older world, but ghosts in a very precise sense, not supernatural presences and not timeless relics, but living descendants of demographic histories that later Eurasia mostly buries beneath layers of mixture and movement. Their bodies belong to the Bronze Age. Their ancestry reaches back toward Ice Age populations whose names are lost because no names survive. Their graves speak a local language of death. Their genes whisper of a continental past too old to be seen in clothing or face alone. That combination makes them one of the rare cases where archaeology and genetics together can reveal not just who interacted with whom, but how deeply time can stack inside a single community. The desert had already taught one lesson by preserving the dead. Now the genomes teach another. A population can be fully part of its present while carrying the weight of a much older past. It can adopt new plants, new craft influences, new strategies of survival, and still remain in ancestry. The bearer of a lineage most of the world has already lost as a distinct form. That is why the Tarim Basin matters so much. It does not merely preserve unusual mummies. It preserves a contradiction at the center of human history that what seems peripheral may be ancient, that what seems connected may remain distinct, and that beneath the visible surface of any culture there may lie an older inheritance surviving long after the rest of the world has forgotten it ever stood alone. The more one looks at the Tarim Basin after the genetic surprise, the clearer it becomes that isolation here is real but never complete. This is one of the most difficult ideas to hold steady, because the mind prefers cleaner arrangements. If the people are genetically unusual, one wants them to be culturally sealed off as well. If they are adopting outside crops and technologies, one wants their ancestry to show heavy outside blending. But the Tarim evidence resists both conveniences. What emerges instead is a world in which a population can remain biologically distinct, while participating actively in a wider network of exchange. The basin becomes a place where contact is constant, yet incorporation is limited, where ideas move more freely than people, and where survival may depend precisely on that balance. This is not as contradictory as it first sounds. Human communities often regulate intimacy more tightly than commerce. They may trade with outsiders, learn from them, imitate useful techniques, or pass through the same corridors seasonally without opening marriage networks widely. In difficult ecological settings, especially, local continuity can be guarded with unusual strength. A community that has learned how to survive a narrow oasis world does not necessarily benefit from dissolving itself into every passing influence. It may borrow what improves resilience while preserving kin structures, ritual continuity, and demographic boundaries. What survives in the record suggests something like this in the Tarim Basin. The mummies are not people cut off from history. They are people choosing, or inheriting. A way of being in history that filters external contact through local terms. The evidence for outside influence is impossible to ignore. Crops such as wheat and barley do not originate in the Tarim Basin. Their deeper story lies farther west. Millet points in another direction, tied more strongly to Eastern agricultural traditions. To find these food systems in the same broad region is to see the old Eurasian world in motion, long before the Silk Road is formally named. Plants travel, and with them travel planting knowledge, storage techniques, harvest timing, and probably new culinary practices. A seed is never only a seed, it is a packet of instruction. The presence of such crops in Tarim contexts suggests that these communities are linked, directly or indirectly, to networks carrying both material and expertise across great distances. Yet the DNA indicates that such connections do not automatically produce heavy genetic mixing. Exchange can be intimate in practice without being intimate in reproduction. The same logic applies to pastoral and craft traditions. Textile techniques with broader Eurasian parallels do not require mass migration by the population that first developed them. Skills can move through apprenticeship, imitation, inter-community contact, small-scale specialist transfer, or the circulation of finished goods that later become local models. A woven pattern can travel farther than a family line. A burial object can outpace the ancestry of the hands that copy it. Even ritual forms, though often conservative, may absorb elements from neighbouring worlds if they fit local meaning. The Tarim communities seem to have done exactly this kind of selective incorporation. Their burial traditions remain distinctive, but their material life is not sealed in a bubble. They are neither untouched nor overwritten. This selective openness may have been one of their greatest strengths. In a harsh environment, refusing all outside influence would be dangerous. New crops might increase resilience. New animal management strategies might improve survival. New textile forms might offer better insulation or easier production. New root knowledge might connect one oasis to another more efficiently. But accepting every outside current equally would also be risky, especially if social coherence is what holds a small community together under pressure. The Basin rewards societies that are adaptable without becoming unstable. The Tarim people begin to look like masters of that difficult art. They're conservative in ancestry, flexible in subsistence, and pragmatic in culture. No single explanation fully accounts for how neatly those elements align, but together they make sense of a population that remains genetically unusual while living in a connected Bronze Age world. There is a broader inner Asian pattern here, though the Tarim case expresses it with uncommon clarity. Frontiers are often not lines but filters. They do not stop movement entirely, they sort it. Some things pass easily, others pass slowly, some pass only after being transformed. The Tarim Basin filters people through ecology. A crop can be tested and adopted if it suits local water conditions. A tool form can be copied if it fits available materials. A belief may be borrowed partially, then folded into older rituals. But large-scale population replacement is harder, because survival here depends on very specific local knowledge, and because the geography channels movement into narrow corridors. A traveller can pass through, a trader can stop and move on, a small group can settle. But to fully absorb the basin's communities is another matter. The environment itself resists simplification. This helps explain why genes and culture tell different but compatible stories. To older scholarship, that difference might have seemed like a contradiction. Now it looks more like normal human complexity preserved under unusually good conditions. The people of the Tarim Basin can remain descended largely from a locally persistent ancestral population, while still drinking from larger streams of Eurasian innovation. Their foods reveal contact, their textiles reveal contact, their geography demands contact. But their deeper ancestry speaks of continuity. In modern terms, one might say they are globally connected and locally rooted, though those words are too modern for their world. Still, the principle holds. A people does not need to become genetically blended in order to become culturally entangled. This distinction also protects against another common misunderstanding. When ancient DNA reveals limited admixture, some readers imagine a society closed by hostility, purity rules, or some deliberate ideology of separation. That may be possible in some historical settings, but here we should be careful. Limited genetic mixing can emerge from many conditions: sparse population density, ecological compartmentalization, social preferences, root structure, or simply the mathematics of small communities interacting intermittently with outsiders. The Tarim Basin does not require a dramatic theory of exclusion to explain continuity. It may only require that contact, though real, remains thin and uneven in demographic terms. A few exchanges per generation are enough to move crops and techniques. They're not enough to erase an old ancestry profile quickly, especially in a population already shaped by local persistence. There is also the question of time depth. Cultural borrowing can happen in pulses. One generation adopts a crop, another improves weaving, another develops a burial custom using local and foreign-looking elements together. Over centuries, the visible world changes substantially. Yet if most marriages still occur within a relatively local population, the genetic profile changes more slowly. This mismatch in speed is one of the most illuminating aspects of the Tarim story. The people buried in the cemeteries may look, to the archaeologist, like members of a cosmopolitan Bronze Age margin, genetically. They're carrying something much older forward. They live at the intersection of fast and slow history. Their tools, foods, and fabrics belong to one timescale. Their ancestry belongs to another. And perhaps that is why the Tarim mummies feel so modern in their lesson, even while belonging to deep antiquity. Many societies, ancient and recent, live with exactly this double condition. They absorb the world without surrendering themselves to it entirely. They remain recognizably local while constantly adapting to wider forces. They survive by learning what to take and what to keep. The Tarim case only seems exotic because the preservation is so dramatic and the genetic results so surprising. In truth, it may represent a very old human pattern, cultural permeability combined with demographic continuity, not as an exception to history, but as one of its recurring forms. Still, the Tarim Basin gives that pattern an unusual sharpness. Here, the graves, the textiles, the crops, and the DNA all survive long enough to be compared directly. The result is a picture more nuanced than either older migration models or simplistic isolation fantasies can capture. These people are not untouched desert relics. They are not straightforward colonists from some distant western homeland. They are a community, or rather a set of related communities, living in an ecological filter that allows them to remain themselves while incorporating pieces of the world around them. The evidence remains incomplete. But what survives in the record suggests precisely this paradox. The more connected they become in culture, the more remarkable their biological continuity appears. So isolation in the Tarim Basin is never simplicity. It is structure. It is the careful management of distance, exchange, inheritance, and survival. It allows a people of deeply unusual ancestry to live fully in the Bronze Age without being swallowed by it. It allows foreign crops to grow in local soil, outside ideas to enter local ritual worlds, and still leaves the dead carrying a lineage that later populations no longer preserve in the same form. The Basin does not keep history out. It lets history in by narrow gates, and in doing so it preserves one of the clearest examples of contact without full blending that the ancient world has left behind. By this point, the temptation to treat the Tarim mummies as solved is stronger than ever. Ancient DNA has upended the old migration story. The cemeteries have shown clear local ritual structure. The daily material record has revealed a people fully adapted to life along the desert margins. Yet one of the most important cautions in the whole story now comes into view, because even after genetics has spoken, the most human questions remain vulnerable to confusion. Who these people are biologically is not the same as who they think they are. How they look is not the same as what language they speak. What they wear is not the same as where their deepest ancestry comes from. And perhaps nowhere is this distinction more necessary than in the Tarim Basin, where appearance, culture, and later historical imagination have so often been collapsed into one misleading picture. The faces are partly responsible for this confusion, and not by any fault of their own. Preserved bodies encourage an instinctive reading. A modern observer sees long noses, high cheek structures, hair that appears brown or reddish in some cases, and immediately begins to sort people into familiar categories. The problem is that those categories are modern, unstable, and badly suited to ancient Eurasia. Physical features vary widely within populations. Hair color can change after burial. Mummification alters skin and soft tissue. Ancient people do not arrange themselves according to the racial shorthand modern viewers carry in their heads. The visual impression of Westernness that shaped so many early interpretations now appears less like a revelation than a warning. Faces can suggest affinity, but they cannot bear the weight of identity on their own. Clothing creates a similar illusion. Wool, felt, woven patterns, boots, hats, and cloaks with apparent parallels elsewhere across Eurasia can make a people seem legible too quickly. Dress feels intimate, and because it feels intimate, it tempts observers to think it must be native in some pure or direct sense. But clothing is one of the most mobile forms of culture. It travels with trade, imitation, practicality, prestige, and adaptation. A garment may be copied because it works well in a particular climate. A weaving method may be borrowed because it produces stronger cloth. A hat shape may spread because it carries status or ritual value. The people of the Tarim Basin clearly understand fibre technology and dress symbolism at a high level, but that does not allow us to read their ancestry off their sleeves. Nor does it allow us to treat every material resemblance as proof of common origin. Language is even more treacherous. Few topics have invited more premature certainty than the question of whether the Tarim mummies can be linked directly to the later Tocharian languages, known from manuscripts in the same broad region during the first millennium CE. On the surface, the idea has an obvious appeal. Later, Indo-European languages are attested in parts of the Tarim world. Earlier preserved mummies seem physically and materially unusual. Put the two together, and it becomes tempting to imagine a direct ancestral chain. But time is the enemy of such neatness. The gap between the Bronze Age burials and the later manuscripts is vast. Populations move, languages shift, elites impose tongues, trade languages spread. Small communities absorb newcomers or are absorbed themselves. A language present in a region many centuries later cannot be projected backward onto ancient remains without much stronger evidence than visual resemblance or geographic overlap. This is where the distinction between genes and identity becomes essential. A community can preserve a very old ancestry profile and still speak a language acquired later. Another can adopt new material culture without changing its speech much at all. Yet another can shift language completely while retaining substantial biological continuity. Human history is full of such rearrangements. The Tarim Basin, with its role as a corridor and filter, is exactly the kind of place where those mismatches are likely. Scholars still debate how, when, and through whom Indo-European languages entered the broader Tarim region, and the evidence remains incomplete. No single explanation fully accounts for the later linguistic history of the basin, let alone the identities of the much earlier mummy populations. That uncertainty is not a weakness in the evidence. It is part of the reality the evidence describes. There is also a more subtle problem. Once a population becomes politically or emotionally charged in modern debate, people begin demanding that identity do too much work. They want the mummies to belong clearly to one later nation, one later ethno-linguistic tradition, one civilizational stream, one historical claim. But ancient communities are under no obligation to fit those needs. The people buried in the Tarim cemeteries may have understood themselves through kin group, oasis affiliation, cemetery tradition, ritual role, or origin myths now entirely lost. They may have had identities that cut across the categories modern scholarship privileges. They may have been internally diverse in ways the archaeology only hints at. To insist that they must already correspond to one later linguistic or ethnic label is to force the dead into an argument they never joined. And yet the mummies continue to pull interpreters toward that force. Their physical presence is too immediate. A beautifully preserved face seems to ask for a name. A striking garment seems to ask for a people. A distinct burial system seems to ask for a language. Modern minds dislike empty boxes, but some boxes remain empty because the evidence necessary to fill them has not survived. What survives in the record suggests a society with stable customs, environmental skill, and deep local continuity. It does not give us a clear self-designation. It does not preserve speech. It does not tell us which myths tied these communities to their ancestors, their land, or their dead. There is a kind of honesty required here that archaeology has to earn again and again to know more than before, and still admit how much remains beyond recovery. This matters because the Tarim mummies have become a lesson not only in ancient population history, but in the dangers of reading too much from surfaces. First, the surfaces of the body mislead, then the surfaces of textiles mislead. Later, even the surfaces of genetic ancestry can mislead if they are treated as total identity. Ancient DNA is powerful, but it can tempt a different simplification, the belief that once ancestry is known, the person is known. That, too, is false. Genes can tell us about lineage, population structure, relatedness, and demographic history. They cannot tell us what song was sung at a burial, what words children learned first, what taboo governed marriage, or what term a community used for outsiders. The Tarim case is so compelling because it constantly forces a division between what can be known and what can only be inferred. There is a lesser known but revealing implication in all this. Misleading appearances are not merely a problem for outsiders. They may also have been part of the ancient social world itself. Communities often use dress, hair, posture, and ritual display to signal difference, status, or belonging in ways that do not align neatly with ancestry. A person may look local and come from elsewhere. Another may look unusual and be deeply rooted in the community. Marriage alliances, adoption, ritual incorporation, fosterage, and mobility all complicate social identity. The dead in the Tarim graves are arranged according to a mortuary language that likely encoded social distinctions meaningful to the living. But those distinctions may not correspond to the categories modern observers most want to recover. Even the people themselves may have understood identity through practice more than descent, through place more than blood, or through ancestry in a symbolic rather than biological sense. The later history of the Tarim region only deepens this caution. Over centuries, the Basin becomes home to shifting populations, languages, religions, and political systems. Buddhist manuscripts appear, oasis kingdoms rise and fall, trade intensifies, Iranian, Indo-European, Turkic, Chinese, Tibetan, and other influences touch the region across different periods. To read the Bronze Age dead through any one later moment is to flatten a vast historical sequence into a single claim of ownership. The mummies are older than those later arrangements. Their world helps make later Tarim history possible, but it is not reducible to it. They belong to a basin with a long memory, not to a slogan. So the lesson of this stage in the story is not merely that earlier scholars guessed wrong, it is that the very desire to convert appearance into identity is part of the problem. The Tarim mummies are visible enough to feel familiar and silent enough to invite projection. That combination is dangerous. Their preserved faces seem to offer certainty, their genes seem to offer certainty, their textiles seem to offer certainty. But each form of evidence is strongest when kept within its proper limits. Together they tell a powerful story of ancestry, adaptation, exchange, and persistence. Beyond that, the historian has to walk carefully. And perhaps that caution is not a disappointment but a form of respect. To refuse to turn these people into mascots for modern categories is to allow them a greater dignity than certainty would. They were not illustrations of a later nation, not evidence for a modern racial myth, not a visual shortcut to language history. They were a real community in a hard landscape, burying their dead with care, adapting to a severe world, borrowing what they needed, and carrying within them a population history far older than their outward appearance could ever reveal. That is already more than enough to make them extraordinary. The mystery does not weaken when neat labels fall away. It becomes truer. By the time the Tarim mummies are understood as a people both deeply rooted and curiously connected, the basin itself begins to look less like a dead end and more like a crossroads under tension. Not the easy crossroads of later romantic imagination, with caravans endlessly drifting through open exchange, but a harsher and older version of the same principle. Here, things travel unevenly, seeds move, fibers move, techniques move, animals move. Perhaps small groups of people move and settle at the margins. Yet the communities that receive these arrivals do not simply dissolve into the stream. They remain themselves even as the world passes through them. This is what makes the Tarim Basin so revealing. It is not only a refuge of old ancestry, it is also a corridor of borrowed things. The evidence for that corridor does not come from one dramatic artifact alone. It emerges gradually through the cumulative logic of subsistence, craft, and environment. Wheat and barley appear in a world where they are not native. Millet enters from a different agricultural sphere. Herding practices reflect links to broader inner Asian lifeways. Textile technologies resonate with traditions spread across wide parts of Eurasia. Even the organization of survival itself suggests familiarity with ideas not born in total isolation. A society living on oasis margins in one of the world's hardest inland environments cannot afford to ignore useful knowledge. If a crop grows in difficult conditions, it matters. If a weaving method makes warmer fabric, it matters. If a herd strategy improves resilience through bad seasons, it matters. The basin filters incoming things not by origin, but by usefulness. That filtering is why the Tarim world never becomes culturally blank, despite its remoteness. The people buried in its cemeteries live in communities that are materially articulate because they are responsive. Their lives are not built from a closed inheritance alone. They are built from a local core strengthened by selective acquisition. This may be the most practical form of openness imaginable. The desert does not reward curiosity for its own sake. It rewards solutions. Borrowed things survive here when they can be translated into local life. A foreign crop must fit the rhythms of water and soil. A new textile practice must work with available fibers and climate. A useful tool must justify the labor required to make or obtain it. In this sense, the basin is less a passive receiver of outside influence than an editor, cutting, keeping, and reshaping what comes in. This process is visible most clearly in food. The movement of crops across Eurasia is one of the great unnoticed revolutions of the ancient world. Long before empires consciously knit continents together, farmers, herders, and small communities are already carrying biological packages across enormous distances. Wheat and barley, with their Western domestication histories, do not belong naturally to the Tarim margins, yet they arrive and become meaningful there. Millet, associated with different Eastern agricultural traditions, also appears in the wider regional picture. Together these crops tell a story not of one dominant civilizational flow, but of converging streams. The Tarim Basin sits where those streams can meet, though never without friction. What survives in the record suggests that communities here are among the beneficiaries of this early Eurasian food exchange, adapting plants from multiple worlds to the narrow ecological possibilities of oasis life. Such adaptation would not have been trivial. A crop is only as useful as the social system that can support it. Planting requires timing, storage, labor coordination, and confidence in future water. Harvest requires tools, preservation methods, and protection from loss. To adopt a new crop is therefore to adopt a set of practices, not just a species. The Tarim communities seem capable of that kind of translation. They do not merely acquire goods, they absorb systems, and yet, strikingly, the absorption does not erase their distinctiveness. The borrowed seed grows in local soil, and in a sense becomes local itself. This is the broader pattern of the basin. Outside things enter, but they enter a world already structured strongly enough to reshape them. The same is true of animals and mobility. Herding lifeways are never purely local inventions in isolation. They belong to broad zones of experimentation and transfer across Eurasia. Knowledge about flock management, seasonal movement, fodder, breeding, and animal products can travel with remarkable speed compared to slower demographic change. The Tarim Basin participates in this larger world of pastoral intelligence. Sheep, in particular, fit both the environment and the archaeological evidence well, tying fibre, food, and movement together in one adaptable package. Yet even here the basin imposes its own terms. Herding on the Tarim margins is not the same as herding on open grassland steppe. Water points, salt levels, seasonal bottlenecks, and oasis ecologies all force modification. Borrowed practices survive only by becoming environmentally specific. Contact, once again, does not produce duplication. It produces transformation. This is why the later Silk Road often casts such a long shadow backward over the Tarim Basin. Once a region becomes famous as a corridor of exchange, it is tempting to imagine that it has always functioned in essentially the same way. But the Bronze Age Tarim world is not yet the caravan network of later centuries. It is more fragmented, more ecological, more uncertain. Exchange happens, but on narrower terms. Routes are less formal, less politically organized, and more dependent on local knowledge. The borrowed things that reach the basin do so through chains of contact, not through a grand unified system. That makes their presence all the more impressive. Even without the infrastructure of later trade, the ancient world is already linked enough for crops, ideas, and craft habits to cross mountains, steppes, and deserts. The Tarim communities stand as proof of that early connectivity, not because they become cosmopolitan in a later urban sense, but because their survival quietly records what has already been moving through Eurasia. There is also a caution hidden in this picture. When archaeologists identify borrowed things, there is often a tendency to assign prestige to their place of origin and passivity to the place where they are found. The Tarim Basin resists that hierarchy. To adopt something successfully in this environment is not imitation at a lower level. It is innovation under pressure. A crop that flourishes in one region may fail in another unless rethought. A burial object borrowed from outside may be stripped of its old meaning and inserted into a new ritual vocabulary. A textile technique may become part of a wholly local style. The communities of the basin are not passive recipients of civilization from elsewhere. They are active translators. They take from multiple directions and make something coherent out of it. This may be one reason their cemeteries feel so difficult to classify. They belong to a people positioned within exchange but not defined by it. Their mortuary language remains distinctive even as their material world shows wider links. Their economy incorporates plants and practices from afar without surrendering to any obvious cultural source wholesale. The result is not hybridity in a superficial sense, as though one could simply label half the burial west and half east. It is a more organic synthesis, one developed over generations until the pieces no longer sit as imports, but as parts of a stable local world. Scholars still debate the exact pathways through which particular crops, techniques, or ideas entered the basin, and the evidence remains incomplete. But no single explanation fully accounts for the Tarim record unless it allows for this dense traffic of things without assuming a parallel traffic of total identity. The basin, then, is a paradoxical kind of meeting point. It is not open enough to erase difference, but not closed enough to prevent influence. It does not produce isolation in the absolute sense, nor mixing in the simple sense. Instead, it produces a layered world, where local continuity is thick but external inputs are constant. This is perhaps why the Tarim mummies feel so intellectually powerful. They reveal a mode of ancient life that does not fit the old oppositions of isolated versus connected, native versus foreign, static versus mobile. Their world contains all of these at once. It is local and transregional, conservative and adaptive, rooted and porous. By following the borrowed things, one begins to see the Tarim Basin less as an anomaly and more as a hidden centre of a different map. Not the centre of political power, and not the centre of monumental civilization, but the centre of a network of survival decisions made at the edge of possibility. Here the great currents of Eurasia arrive in modest forms: a seed, a fibre, a technique, a herd strategy, a shape of cloth, a habit of storage. The people who receive them do not announce themselves in writing. They leave no triumphant imperial inscription. Instead, they leave bodies, textiles, plant remains, and graves. Through these, the desert records the quiet fact that exchange does not always belong to cities or empires. Sometimes it belongs to small communities in hard places, taking what the wider world offers and turning it into another season of life. And that is the deeper significance of the Tarim crossroads. It is not merely that the Basin connected worlds. It is that it showed how connection could exist without overwhelming local identity. Borrowed things came in, but the people remained distinctly themselves. Crops crossed continents, but genes did not follow at the same rate. Techniques moved through strangers' hands, then settled into local memory. The dead beneath the desert sky are therefore not only evidence of lost ancestry, they are also witnesses to a human truth older than recorded trade that cultures often grow not by surrendering to outside influence, but by taking it in carefully, under pressure, and making it answer to the demands of place. By now, the mystery has become rich enough to attract exactly the kinds of explanations that usually gather around the edges of ancient history stories too neat, too grand, too politically useful, or too emotionally satisfying to survive careful contact with the evidence. The Tarim mummies, with their preserved faces, unusual burials, striking textiles, and unexpected DNA, seem almost designed to provoke them. A population in Bronze Age Western China appears visually surprising to modern eyes, then turns out genetically unusual in ways even specialists did not first expect. That combination is irresistible to fringe theory. It creates an opening for people who want the past to affirm a modern identity, justify a civilizational myth, or prove that history moves in simple lines from one superior centre outward. In that sense, the Tarim mummies do not merely reveal ancient complexity, they expose modern hunger for simplification. Some of the most common false readings begin with the body. Light or reddish-looking hair in a mummy becomes proof of direct descent from one later people or another. A long nose becomes evidence of race in a modern sense. Preserved facial structure becomes a passport to a continent. None of this is serious reasoning. Hair can change in burial. Soft tissue shifts under desiccation. Physical features do not map cleanly onto modern ethnic categories. And modern ethnic categories do not map cleanly onto Bronze Age populations. Yet the visual power of the mummies has encouraged decades of confident overstatement. A photograph circulates, and by the time it reaches the public imagination, the person in the grave has already been claimed by someone who was never there and speaks a language that did not yet exist in that form. Another version of the myth turns on civilizational diffusion. In this reading, The Tarim mummies become proof that the important technologies or cultural developments of Inner Asia and beyond must have come from a familiar Western source. Their textiles look Western to some observers, so weaving must have come with migrants. Their crops include Western domesticates, so agriculture must have been carried whole by incoming populations. Their bodily appearance looks surprising, so sophistication itself must have arrived from elsewhere. This is the old habit of treating some regions as historical authors and others as blank pages. The Tarim Basin quietly demolishes that habit. The evidence shows outside contacts, certainly, but it also shows strong local ritual structure, selective adaptation, and demographic continuity too unusual to fit a simple colonizing narrative. Borrowing is real. Replacement is not the default answer. Then there is the temptation to weaponize language, because later Indo-European languages are attested in the broader Tarim region. Some readers want the mummies to become straightforward early speakers of those languages, and from there a chain of historical ownership begins. But the chronological gap is too large, the evidence too incomplete, and the relationship between genes, language, and identity too unstable for that leap. A later language in the same broad region does not solve the earlier burial populations. It may connect in some way, or it may not connect directly at all. Scholars still debate the pathways involved, and no single explanation fully accounts for the transition from Bronze Age populations to the historically attested linguistic landscape of later centuries. To pretend otherwise is not boldness, it is impatience disguised as certainty. Nationalist versions of the story are just as unreliable, even when they pull in different directions. One camp wants the mummies to prove that the region was somehow always fundamentally tied to one later identity. Another wants to deny anything unusual in the burials because unusual evidence seems politically inconvenient. Both mistakes come from the same impulse, the need to make ancient people serve modern territorial arguments. But the Tarim mummies are older than those arguments. They belong to a prehistoric and Bronze Age world in which later nations, languages, and state borders do not yet exist in meaningful form. To force them into modern categories is to flatten time itself. The dead become props. Their complexity is reduced to a slogan. The fringe imagination, of course, often goes even farther. There are speculative claims that the mummies represent a lost master race, a vanished transcontinental civilization, or some forgotten ruling people whose superiority radiated across Eurasia. There are more romantic fantasies in which they become pure survivors of a mysterious primeval nation, untouched by mixture. There are even occasional hints of the supernatural or pseudo-historical, as though ordinary human adaptation and deep ancestry are not dramatic enough on their own. But none of this is needed. The real story is already stranger than those inventions, precisely because it is constrained by evidence. A Bronze Age population in the Tarim Basin preserves ancestry from a deeply ancient Eurasian lineage while living in a culturally connected world and building burial traditions unlike any neat neighbouring model. That is not a disappointment compared to fantasy. It is better than fantasy because it actually happened. One reason unsupported theories flourish here is that the legitimate evidence really does contain tension. The mummies look one way, their genes tell a more complex story, their material culture shows borrowed elements, and their burial customs remain highly distinctive. To someone unaccustomed to how messy ancient history can be, this may feel like contradiction. Fringe theory rushes into that discomfort and offers relief. It says that one clue must be the true one, and all the others can be forced into place around it. Serious scholarship does the opposite. It accepts that humans are complicated, that genes and culture move at different speeds, that the visible body can mislead, and that ancient communities often resist the categories imposed on them. The Tarim mummies are compelling not because they collapse into one explanation, but because they do not. What survives in the record supports some conclusions strongly. These communities are locally rooted in the Tarim Basin. Their early Bronze Age ancestry is highly unusual and not well represented by any living population in direct form. Their material world shows connections across wider Eurasia. Their burial traditions are coherent, repeated, and culturally distinctive. Their environment helps explain both their survival and their continuity. These are robust findings. Beyond them, caution becomes essential. The exact social meanings of the graves remain partly obscure. The full linguistic history is unresolved. The pathways of every borrowed technique or crop are not always traceable in detail. The political meanings modern readers try to attach to the mummies are unsupported by the evidence itself. There is a less obvious cost to fringe explanation as well. It can make the real human achievement disappear. If the Tarim mummies are turned into mere symbols of race, conquest, or civilizational prestige, then the harder and more interesting truth about their lives gets neglected. These were communities surviving in one of the harshest inland landscapes on Earth. They developed mixed economies, complex burial systems, textile sophistication, and durable social continuity under ecological pressure. They adopted useful things from a wide world without being erased by that world. They buried their dead with care. They lasted long enough for an ancient lineage to remain visible in their descendants. That is a human story, not a propaganda tool. And perhaps that is why unsupported theories feel so unsatisfying once the actual evidence is taken seriously. They're too small for the reality they try to explain. A slogan about Western migrants, or early Tacharians, or lost rulers, or national ownership reduces the Tarim Basin to one axis when the real story runs on several at once: ancestry, ecology, craft, exchange, ritual, and disappearance. The mystery is compelling because it reveals a population that cannot be solved by face alone, by language alone, by genes alone, or by political desire alone. Every time one of those single key explanations is tried, something vital is left out. So the theories that do not hold are useful in one sense. They show where the pressure points are. They show what modern readers most want from the ancient world: confirmation, clarity, ancestry that behaves like identity, and history that can be pointed in one direction like an arrow. The Tarim mummies offer none of those comforts. Instead, they offer a more difficult and more truthful lesson. Ancient people could be deeply local and broadly connected. They could preserve old lineage while borrowing new lifeways. They could look familiar and still be genetically unexpected. They could leave clear graves and unclear identities. That is not failure of evidence. It is the shape of the past itself. By stripping away the weak theories, what remains is not emptiness, but sharper wonder. The dead in the Tarim Basin do not need to be turned into founders of someone else's story. They already have one. It is the story of a desert population whose presence breaks simple maps, whose ancestry carries echoes of a world older than their own, and whose carefully made cemeteries preserve just enough to remind us how much history survives only when we stop asking it to flatter us. The unsupported explanations fall away because they are too eager to resolve the mystery. The real story endures because it allows the mystery to remain where it belongs, inside the evidence, not outside it. Once the false certainties are stripped away, the Tarim mummies begin to reveal something larger than their own local enigma. They become a test of how human history is written at all. For generations, scholars and the public alike have been tempted by clean migration maps, by arrows sweeping across continents, by the idea that populations move, replace, and found new worlds in legible succession. Those maps are not always wrong, but they are often too smooth. The Tarim Basin introduces resistance into them. It shows that ancestry can persist where geography narrows movement, that culture can travel without full demographic takeover, and that a population can appear at once connected to many worlds and reducible to none of them. In that sense, the mummies do not merely add a curious footnote to Eurasian prehistory. They force the broader narrative to become more realistic. One of the most important consequences of this discovery is methodological. The old habit of aligning material culture too closely with biological population no longer looks safe. A textile pattern cannot simply be read as ancestry. A burial form cannot automatically stand in for language. A crop cannot prove migration on its own. Ancient DNA, in turn, cannot be allowed to become a new total explanation that swallows all other evidence. The Tarim story works precisely because it resists every monocausal framework. Archaeology reveals ritual distinctiveness and practical adaptation. Environmental history explains the ecological filter that preserves bodies and perhaps populations. Genetics uncovers deep ancestry invisible to the eye. Together they produce a picture richer than any one discipline could have delivered alone. What survives in the record suggests that the future of prehistory lies in exactly this kind of layered reading. The implications stretch far beyond the Tarim Basin, across Eurasia, and indeed across the world. There are likely many cases where visible culture and deep ancestry fail to line up in the simple ways older scholarship once preferred. Communities borrow, elites impose styles, crops outrun people, marriage networks remain local while trade routes become vast. Small populations survive in difficult places long after their nearest demographic relatives have blended into others. The Tarim mummies are therefore not only extraordinary in themselves, they are a warning that other solved ancient histories may be less settled than they appear. When one population in a desert basin can preserve a lineage from a much older world while living fully in the Bronze Age, the old confidence of broad civilizational storytelling begins to look more fragile. There is also a deeper human lesson in what the mummies reveal about survival. History often celebrates size, power, and expansion. It remembers empires because empires leave walls, archives, and monuments. Small communities in severe landscapes are usually harder to see. Their success is quieter. They survive drought years, route shifts, and ecological pressure. They teach children how to manage water, herd animals, store grain, weave cloth, and bury the dead in a meaningful way. They are less likely to dominate a continent, but more likely to carry forward old inheritances by persistence alone. The Tarim people seem to belong to this category of human endurance. Their legacy is not conquest, it is continuity under pressure, and in the long run, that may tell us as much about the species as the rise of any kingdom. The genetic findings sharpen that point in an almost unsettling way. Here is a population carrying a lineage that, in a distinct form, the modern world no longer preserves. That fact alone changes how one thinks about disappearance. Not all lost peoples vanish in fire or conquest. Some disappear by dilution, by incorporation, by long sequences of small changes that leave no dramatic catastrophe behind. They become part of later populations without remaining recognizable as themselves. The Tarim mummies happen to be visible because preservation is exceptional and DNA survives. But there must have been countless other communities whose distinctness faded without such luck. The mummies therefore stand for more than their own ancestry. They stand for the vast number of human lineages history has absorbed so completely that only fragments remain. This also reframes the idea of civilization itself. Civilizations are often imagined as coherent, bounded entities with clear centers and identities. The Tarim evidence suggests something less orderly. Human worlds overlap, filter through one another, and exchange practical knowledge without resolving into a single cultural block. A desert-edge society can use crops from multiple agricultural traditions, maintain burial customs unlike those of its neighbors, and preserve ancestry from a much older demographic horizon. If that is true, then civilization is not always a bounded whole moving outward. Sometimes it is an accumulation of borrowings, local survivals, and environmental improvisations. Sometimes the most revealing societies are not the largest ones, but the ones that show how much complexity can exist without empire. For the study of Eurasia in particular, the Tarim Basin becomes impossible to ignore. It sits between worlds often narrated separately: early East Asia, the Inner Asian steppe, Central Asia, and the deeper northern zones associated with Ice Age populations. The Mummies reveal that these worlds cannot be understood as sealed containers occasionally touching at the edges. They overlap in more selective and uneven ways. The basin is part shelter, part corridor, part archive. Its communities draw from the wider continent but do not simply mirror it. Scholars still debate many details of how those interactions unfolded, and the evidence remains incomplete on numerous local questions. But no single explanation fully accounts for Eurasian prehistory anymore if it leaves out places like this, where continuity and contact coexist so clearly. There is a more intimate consequence as well. The Tarim mummies make it harder to imagine the ancient past as populated by anonymous, interchangeable groups. Their preservation restores individuality in a way that statistics alone cannot. A genome may show ancestry, but the body shows presence. A coffin shape shows ritual. A woven garment shows labor. A plant offering shows choice. This combination makes the broader lessons of population history feel less abstract. The vanished lineage is not floating in a graph. It is wrapped in wool, laid carefully into a grave, and placed beneath wooden markers in the desert. Science expands the scale of the story, but the preserved dead keep pulling it back to the human level. That tension may be the most powerful thing about them. It also explains why their discovery continues to resonate beyond specialist circles. People sense, even before they understand the data, that the mummies disturb a common assumption about the past, the belief that time naturally sorts everything into neat succession. In reality, time preserves pockets. It layers old worlds beneath newer ones. It allows a Bronze Age community to carry an Ice Age echo. It allows borrowed crops to grow beside ancient ancestry. It allows a face that seems to promise one story to conceal another. The Tarim Basin is one of those rare places where time's untidy habits become visible enough to study directly. And yet, for all this, the mummies do not overturn history into chaos. They do something more useful. They make it subtler. They do not prove that everything is uncertain or that no patterns exist. On the contrary, they show that patterns become stronger when they allow for irregularity. Human beings move, mix, adapt, persist, and disappear according to many pressures at once: climate, geography, kinship, trade, disease, social preference, chance. The Tarim story is powerful because it gathers several of those pressures in one place and preserves the result with unusual clarity. It is not a refutation of historical method, it is an improvement of it. So what the dead reveal about humanity is not simply that one mysterious population once lived in Western China. They reveal that human history is more retentive than it appears, and more fragile too. Old lineages can survive unexpectedly long. Distinct communities can vanish almost completely. Contact does not erase identity automatically. Isolation does not prevent innovation. Harsh environments can preserve both bodies and ancestry, even while making daily life precarious. The modern world, with all its categories and political claims, is not well equipped to absorb these lessons easily, but the Tarim mummies insist on them all the same. Seen this way, the basin becomes more than a site of extraordinary preservation. It becomes a mirror held up to the species. Humans are migrants, certainly, but not only migrants, they are borrowers, but not only borrowers. They are descendants of lost branches, carriers of mixed inheritances, builders of local worlds in difficult places, and survivors whose identities often outrun the categories later ages try to assign them. The people buried beneath the desert sky of the Tarim Basin embody all of that at once. Their bodies remain because the sand and salt allowed it. Their significance remains because their existence forces a broader humility on the story of who humans have been. In the end, the Tarim Basin does not give up its people easily. Even after decades of excavation, analysis, and genetic study, the sense of distance remains intact. The graves are clear, the bodies are visible, the textiles can be touched and studied. The ancestry can be traced far deeper than anyone once believed possible, and yet the essential human story, the one that binds all those elements into a lived experience, stays just beyond reach. What emerges instead is something more complex than resolution. It is a layered memory, part recovered, part inferred, and part permanently lost. The modern legacy of the Tarim mummies reflects that tension. They sit in museums, sometimes behind glass, sometimes reproduced in photographs that travel far beyond the desert that preserved them. They become subjects of documentaries, academic debates, political discussions, and public fascination. Their faces are shared widely, often detached from the careful context scholars work to maintain. The same features that once misled early interpretation continue to draw attention. Even now that the deeper genetic story is known, in this way, the mummies continue to live a second life, not in the desert but in the modern imagination, where they are still asked to answer questions they were never meant to answer. There is also a quieter struggle around them, one that reflects how powerful ancient remains can be in shaping present identity. The Tarim Basin lies within a region that has long been a meeting point of cultures, languages, and political interests. The discovery of such striking ancient bodies inevitably becomes entangled in these modern realities. Questions of heritage, ownership, interpretation, and representation emerge. Who has the right to tell their story? How should they be displayed? What narratives should accompany them? These are not purely academic questions. They reveal how deeply the past still matters and how easily it can be drawn into present concerns. Yet beneath all of that, the mummies themselves remain unchanged. They are not political actors. They are not advocates for any modern identity. They are individuals who lived, adapted, and died in a very specific environment, long before current debates took shape. Their burial traditions speak of care, continuity, and belief, even if the exact meanings are no longer recoverable. Their textiles speak of skill. Their bodies speak of survival in a harsh world. Their DNA speaks of a lineage that endured where others dissolved. These are facts that stand apart from interpretation, even if interpretation inevitably surrounds them. There is something fragile about that boundary. Archaeology can illuminate the past, but it can also expose it to reinterpretation, simplification, or misuse. The Tarim mummies show both sides clearly. They demonstrate how new methods, especially ancient DNA, can transform understanding in profound ways. They also show how quickly those transformations can be absorbed into narratives that go beyond what the evidence supports. The responsibility, then, is not only to uncover but to hold back. To resist the urge to finalize what remains open, the desert itself plays a role in maintaining that openness. It preserves, but it does not explain. It holds bodies in remarkable condition, but it does not tell their stories in full. It creates the illusion of clarity, because so much survives, while still withholding the essential human details that give those remains complete meaning. This is why the Tarim Basin feels so different from places where history is recorded in writing. There are no inscriptions here to settle debates, no voices to clarify intention. There is only material, pattern, and inference. The rest must be approached with caution. And yet, even in that incompleteness, something enduring remains. The Tarim mummies reveal that entire populations can exist at the intersection of survival and disappearance. They can build stable lives in difficult landscapes, develop complex traditions, and carry forward ancient ancestry, only to fade from memory almost entirely. They remind us that what survives into the present is often the result of chance as much as importance. A dry climate, a particular burial method, a fortunate alignment of conditions. These determine whether a people will be seen again. That realization changes how the past is viewed. It suggests that history is not a complete archive, but a selective one. For every preserved body in the Tarim Basin, there may have been countless others in less forgiving environments whose traces are gone forever. For every lineage that can be reconstructed through DNA, there are others that left no recoverable signal. The mummies do not represent all of humanity. They represent a rare window, opened by accident and studied by persistence. As the story reaches its final point, the Tarim Basin returns to silence. The cemeteries remain where they were placed, their wooden markers weathered, their coffins buried beneath shifting sand. The rivers that once sustained nearby life have moved or vanished. The communities that built those graves are gone, not in a single moment, but through gradual change, absorption, and time itself. What remains is not a lost civilization in the dramatic sense, but something quieter and more profound. A record of human existence shaped by adaptation, continuity, and eventual disappearance. The desert keeps that record without comment. It does not distinguish between what modern observers consider important and what it does not. It preserves what it can, erases what it must, and leaves behind a landscape where memory survives in fragments. The Tarim mummies are among those fragments, unusually complete, unusually revealing, but still only part of a much larger story that will never be fully told. In that sense, their mystery is not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be understood. They show that the past is not waiting to be simplified. It is waiting to be approached carefully, with the awareness that even the most extraordinary discoveries are only partial answers. The Tarim Basin offers clarity and obscurity at the same time, and in doing so, it reflects the nature of history itself preserved in pieces, interpreted in layers, and always larger than the explanations built around it. The wind over the Tarim Basin moves as it always has, carrying fine grains of sand across a landscape that seems unchanged and yet is never still. Beneath that surface, the dead remain where they were placed, their presence both immediate and distant. They are not voices, and they do not speak, but they hold a kind of quiet testimony that persists without words. Time has thinned their world, leaving only what the desert allowed to endure. The living settlements are gone. The routines of daily life have dissolved. The names, the relationships, the small moments that once defined their existence have faded beyond recovery. And yet, through a rare alignment of environment and chance, something remains, a body wrapped in cloth, a hand positioned with care, a fragment of plant placed beside the dead. These are not explanations, they are traces. The Tarim mummies remind us that history is not built only from what is remembered. It is also shaped by what is forgotten, by what disappears, and by what survives unexpectedly. Entire populations can pass through time leaving almost nothing behind, while others remain visible because the conditions allowed it. The difference is not always significance. Sometimes it is simply survival. Looking across the desert, it becomes clear how fragile that survival is. The same forces that preserve these bodies could easily have erased them. A shift in climate, a change in burial practice, a difference in soil composition, and this entire story might never have reached the present. The past would be smaller, simpler, and less true. Instead, what remains is a reminder of complexity. The people of the Tarim Basin lived within constraints, adapted to them, and created a life that balanced continuity with change. They carried forward an ancestry older than their own time. Even as they engaged with the world around them, they were part of a larger human story, yet distinct within it. As the light fades over the basin, the silence deepens. The graves are still. The mountains stand unchanged. The desert continues its slow, patient movement. Nothing in the landscape signals the presence of those who once lived here, except for the knowledge that beneath the surface they remain. And perhaps that is the final image to carry forward. Not a solved mystery, but a preserved one. Not a clear conclusion, but a deeper understanding of how much of the past lies beyond reach. The Tarim mummies do not close the story of human history. They widen it, leaving space for what is known, what is uncertain, and what may never be recovered.